for our board of directors. And Marina Coast Water District Groundwater Sustainability Agency with regard to one item tonight. We will start with a roll call.
Director Cortez.
Here.
Director Imamura.
Present.
Director Moore.
Here.
Vice President Schreiner. Here. President Moore. Morton. I didn't finish it.
That's okay. Yes, I'm here also. Great. And our agenda does not have a pledge of allegiance, but we all can just signal that we value the structures that the US government stands for. And we had a good election this week. Anyway, so the workshop, we're going to receive a presentation on the rate scenarios for our 2024 wastewater recycled water study from Hildebrand Consulting. But I think Mary Legasco is going to start us, or no? Last time you did? It said presented by, I'm reading my.
Okay, so good evening or good afternoon, still bright. Members of the board, fellow staff and the public. Tonight or this afternoon, we are conducting our second rate study workshop. Last February 22, we had our first workshop and we heard from Mark Hildebrand, our district's rate study consultant. And he presented the preliminary findings for the district and showed us the baseline scenario for each cost center given minimal capital spending. The direction given by the board was to come back with alternative scenarios showing incremental increases in capital spending. And that is what we have for you tonight. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mark.
Thank you. And Mark, while you're getting started, I'm going to ask you again, just to be sure that you're comfortable with us interrupting you with questions as you present, or would you rather we wait till the closure of a few slides and you ask us questions?
Thank you for asking. I'm happy with you jumping in. I think it went really well last time, and I appreciated the input.
Okay, great. Thank you. So whenever you're ready.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for having me again this evening. We have more refined findings based on the feedback we got during the last meeting, and we'd like to present that to you this evening. The agenda, I'll go very briefly over a few slides that you've seen before, namely items 1 and 2 in the agenda, rate setting background, how it's done in California, just quite quickly, and then financial plan findings and scenarios. So what we've added to the financial plan findings, which was really what we covered mostly last meeting, is that we added or we created 2 different scenarios that describe 2 different levels of capital spending that we will describe for each of the cost centers. And that will be the focus. So I won't spend as much time talking about the background and the assumptions that went into the financial plans, because we covered that last time, but we'll get to those scenarios a bit quicker. And then once I've described the scenarios, then we'll talk about some of the rate structure recommendations that are being made within the context of those rate increases for those scenarios. So background for rate setting in California, we have to comply with, the district has to comply with Proposition 218. It's part of the California Constitution. And it basically says that you can't charge more than the cost of providing service, and that there's a procedural process to go through a noticing requirement and a opportunity for ratepayers to protest if they wish to do so. The rate setting process involves a financial plan, also known as the revenue requirements, cost, service, and rate design. So up until now, we've really just focused on this first box on the financial planning. This evening, I'll be able to show you the completed numbers, the proposed completed the numbers that go all the way through cost, service, and rate design. So some general topics, just as a reminder, the district or this study is examining 5 cost centers within the district. There's marina water, marina sewer, board water, board sewer, and recycled water. There are two other cost centers that are not being covered by this study. And each cost center incurs both direct and indirect costs that are allocated based on the cost allocation plan. Really briefly, when we look at the financial plan and look at the next 10 years, we have to make some assumptions about how costs are going to behave going forward. We don't have a crystal ball, but we do know what's been happening lately and what has happened historically. And we have some ideas of things like PG&E has been raising their rates pretty significantly. So we did make some assumptions that are listed up here in terms of what inflation is going to look like for the district's costs. So this was a slide that was presented during the last meeting, and these numbers are a bit different. The numbers were bigger in the last presentation, and that was because this slide included all capital spending previously. I believe it was 140 million instead of 90 million. That included a bunch of expansion projects that aren't paid for by ratepayers. We know those are paid for by developers and whatnot. So in order to focus this more on the projects that are relevant to your ratepayers, we whittled it down to really just focus on what we call R&R projects. I'll use that term frequently. R&R refers to repair and replacement. And it's basically any kind of infrastructure investment that you make to rehabilitate and to keep your infrastructure operating, as opposed to expanding your system to be able to serve new customers. So that R&R CIP had identified $90 million over 5 years, which comes out to about $17.6 million per year. And you can see how that breaks down by cost center.
So I just want to interrupt here, just for the public, if anybody's listening. Last time when you had the R&R and our expansion of the system, our targeted annual spending was 28.9 million.
Right.
So this is a significant drop,
Right.
but this is focused on R&R, which are almost the mandatory things that we have to do, or things that can be funded by our rates.
That's right.
Okay, perfect.
And those expansion projects can either happen or they don't, depending on whether or not development actually happens. And the nice thing about those projects is that when developers do come, they pay their capacity charges, and that gives you the money that you need for those projects. So those projects will pay for themselves as growth demands them.
Perfect.
But these projects, as you say, are paid for by existing ratepayers. So this is where I paused last time to allow the general manager to say some words about the capital spending program and what goes into that $90 million. I don't know. So we're good. So we'll just look at these nice pictures and my really bad photoshopping skills and move on. So we did revise the capital improvement program goals. So as was previously shown, those $90 million that we just showed, that was part of the original 5-year plan. After last meeting, we recognized that the rates that were being proposed were certainly a stretch, were going to be difficult for your ratepayers. And so the district staff got together and really focused on the projects to really understand which projects were critical, which projects could be deferred, and trying to whittle down what really needs to happen over the next 5 years. And so the general scenario that's being proposed here tonight is that the district would issue a $20 million bond. So you can see in the first box, there would be 3 cost centers that would be participating in that bond. And then PAYGO refers to pay as you go, which is basically cash funding as opposed to debt financing. So PAYGO R&R would be the remainder of the capital spending. And so put together, that would be $51 million, almost $52 million across all 5 cost centers. So that's the baseline capital spending going forward at this point, that is are the projects that district engineer and staff have identified as being critical.
So the key, I'm sorry, I'm not asking all these questions. Does anybody else have any questions? Director Moore.
One quick one. Why no bond funding on the word sewer?
Why,
So,
Cost center.
no bond,
it's a good question, and when we get to that slide, it'll be easier to explain, but basically, board sewer does not require bond funding. They are in a position that they have sufficient reserves, and they have enough rate revenue that they're not in a situation where they need to bond finance anything. The only reason that we're recommending bond funding for any cost center is because there's immediate capital spending needs that existing rates, that your current rates can't support. And so in order to be able to fund these projects that need to happen now, you need to go borrow for the money. Board sewer is not in a position where they need to borrow money, and so we excluded them from that list.
thank you.
And Director Vice President Schreiner.
Grants are excluded in this situation or?
Grants are not included. If you receive grants, then you'll be able to deliver more capital spending.
Okay.
But yeah, we've excluded it from this. Because the assumption is that if you receive the grant, you do the project, and if you don't receive the grant, you won't do the projects.
General Manager.
Okay, so go back really quickly, Mark. I just want to hammer this point a little bit more. So the bond funded renewal replacement, you guys, that's different than typical bond funding expansion.
Got it.
So we're not building a new tank, none of that stuff. What we found when we went back was we needed to bond fund work that needed to have occurred in the past. So the current customers are actually paying forward to try to get some of the capital done. That's why it's here.
And that was my question. Director Cortez? Director Imamura? Okay, that was my question, is how you came up with the 20 million. And the point is that's the fall short because we have to do the work immediately. So we're gonna do the work on credit.
Correct.
Okay, perfect.
That's right.
But I didn't know how you chose the number until just this explanation. Thank you. Director Moore.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, if we had a time machine, we could go back 10 years, have raised our rates 10 years ago, and saved up enough money so we wouldn't have to borrow now.
Correct.
But we didn't do that.
You did not.
So we're burdening ratepayers with some future interest costs, but we didn't burden them with those costs going into reserves starting 10 years ago. So good news, bad news.
Correct, yeah, so there is an intergenerational equity questions, and, and it can be argued both ways, as you point out. When you bond finance now, then you're burdening future ratepayers, and if you cash finance now, you're burdening current ratepayers who may be paying for assets that will be here long after they are no longer here, right? So either way, there's always gonna be sort of intergenerational inequities to talk about. And there's no right answer. But it's an astute observation.
So, but then on that slide, the point that staff has come up with is the recommendation that you use 20 million in credit and you're equitably proportioning to current ratepayers this 31,986 on their rates.
Right.
So you have found it's not an equal balance, but it's found the balance based on the needs that we need to tend to immediately.
Correct. So, and I wanted, so this is a conversation that Mark and I had, it seems like last week, seems like yesterday. I think the thing is that we don't want to put people into this conversation. This is meters, right? So the meters, the accounts that weren't funding R&R at level X, those meters now will get the benefit of this new infrastructure. So yes, there is an intergenerational issue, but the meter that the property enjoys is constant. So that meter then will pay itself to get itself into the right spot.
That's a great distinction. So the 31,986,000 is meter generated. Perfect. That's a clear slide. Thank you.
So we'll jump into the water cost centers. Before we look at specific center, just a reminder of where you stand currently with the rates in the region. So you're certainly in the lower half of rates in the area, with some of the other agencies significantly more expensive than both Marina and Warren. So looking at Warren Water, so this one slide captures about 4 or 5 slides that I showed previously. And the bottom line that I just wanted to show is Warren Water started this fiscal year with almost $5 million in cash. Total revenues, all in, excluding grants and other one-time revenues, was 14.3 million. The operating budget and debt was 11.8. And so what all that tells me is that leaves us with about $2.5 million left over to pay for annual capital costs. And you contrast this, if you go back to here, Ord Water has identified $9.1 million in needs of annual capital spending. So that's just the sort of a snapshot of this current fiscal year and the amount that Ord Water would be able to pay for in capital if they were just to continue with existing rates. So here's a really long list of the almost comprehensive list of the 5 years of capital spending projects for the baseline. With scenario 1 would be the baseline. When we talk about scenario 2, it's going to be the baseline with a few deferred projects to try to identify a lower rate that might be tenable, but less desirable in terms of the infrastructure of the district. So we gave you a long list here. Obviously, we won't go through all of these, but just to give you a taste of the types of projects that are being proposed over the next 5 years and their costs.
So the last line on there, the print small,
Yeah.
is 2025 bond projects.
Yeah.
So that's from the $20 million projected bond, or I'm trying to keep up with you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So the 2025 bond projects, some of these projects will be debt financed, and there's an additional $7.8 million that will pay for additional bond projects. And maybe you could jump in on.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to,
No, it's so
Make it relate.
in the blue and green sheets, we had certain projects that were completely funded by bonds.
oh,
We took that out of this because they're not needed in the R&R component, but they are going to be needed as part of our expansion. So instead of muddying this conversation about scenario 1 and scenario 2 and which ones R&R would turn toggle on and off, the 25 bond projects, those live on the blue and green sheet. So they're outside of the rate setting necessarily, other than the debt load that it will cause.
and is this the debt load?
No,
So,
that's the borrowing that will occur to accomplish those.
okay. Okay, seems like it's mixing apples and oranges in your 27 million, but I'll follow along. Go ahead, Director,
I want
Vice
to,
President.
so on page 10, is that what you just referred to, the R&R, where it says revised capital improvement program goals, and then
Yes.
that has bond funded R&R is 20 million, but this is expansion, this 2025 bond project on page 15, the whole separate group of expansion projects, is that right?
Yeah, I think that's right. So you take that, so help me, Mark, if I get that wrong. So take $11 million.
11.5 million will be issued by Ord Water. So about, if you go to this number, so about 4 million of that are projects that are in that list.
That are R&R projects.
There are R&R projects, and then there's leftover $7.8 million that will be
Used for
spent
expansion.
on.
So other projects, tank
Okay.
expansion, stuff like that.
Okay.
I'm just trying to figure out the annual net we're trying to crack, and so when you put this as 27, but on the last slide, it's a lower number. I just didn't understand why it's included here, other than if you're just giving us the broad scope of things, but that 7.8 million is not going to be in the rates because it's coming from some other source.
So it's going to be in the rates because it's debt. That's why it's here. But it's not going to be used to do R&R
It's only gonna be used for expansion.
expansion.
Okay, so it's already here.
Yeah.
Okay.
The board has identified it in the blue and green and in the capital program. The problem that we were faced with was we needed to be able to segregate out the projects that you, the board, would be toggling on and off as you went through the scenarios. Bond funded projects, capacity fee
Right, they're
projects,
static.
they're static, they're outside the scope of the conversation. But if we're borrowing, it is influencing rates because we're having to pay for the borrowing.
The debt service.
You got it.
So in this particular scenario, in scenario one, I'll remind you that the top graph shows in the background, green represents revenue, and so the dark green at the bottom represents miscellaneous revenue. The light green in the middle represents your existing rate revenue. The dark green at the top represents additional rate revenue that will come from the rate increases that are being proposed. The proposed rate increases are shown down third row from the bottom, which would be 10% per year for 3 years, followed by 2 6% rate increases. We are talking about a 5-year proposal of rate increases. So the 3% increases thereafter are just projections of what we expected. Going back to the top graph, the columns represent expenses. So the dark blue are operating expenses. The hashed blue in the middle is debt service, which you can see it increases in 2025 from that new bond issue. And then the light blue at the top represents capital spending, which you can see is held quite low in 24 and 25. And then increases in 26 and thereafter. The reserves are shown in the graph in the middle with the minimum reserve target at the red line. The green line represents the projected reserves, which you can see dips down to the minimum out in 2028, 29, and then slowly starts to recover and starts working its way back up to the target reserve. Doesn't quite get there over the next 10 years, but it is on a trajectory that we're comfortable with. And that target reserve is a long-term target that we think we'll achieve over the long term.
Question.
Yes.
Can you, maybe you have, I haven't gone through your whole presentation, but maybe you have a slide on it. I think last time I suggested maybe giving a typical bill. I'm speaking for the public, so they can get a better idea. When you say rate increases, what is that? Just for water or just overall, just in general? Their bill?
So when I talk about rate increase, this is rate revenue to the districts. So people's bills will change by a different percentage depending on whether they use more water or less water, that type of thing. But the percentages are how much additional rate revenue the district will receive. So yeah, overall, on average, your customers will see these percent increases.
Yeah, I wanted to make that distinction because, but the typical years, you're gonna say, well, what is that? I'm paying $150 a month right now. Is that what? It's gonna go up 10% or something.
And I will have slides that are gonna show specific bills.
Great.
Yeah, that'll come later.
To the next, along the
Yes.
same line, last time you were talking about how projected growth has a dynamic in the rate revenue increase. So if Ord has a 5% projected growth rate, then how do you factor that for getting to a 10% rate revenue?
Well, you see how the light green in the middle here is increasing, despite the dark green? So that's the growth that's occurring. So as your customer base increases, so if you didn't have any rate increases, your revenue would be going up because of that growth. So that is built into the model.
And that was a 5%, or do they use?
Yeah, we were using 5% as an assumption from forward. Right. And then importantly, you can see the debt coverage ratio, second to bottom row. The lowest would still be over 2.0. This is a combined debt coverage ratio across all cost centers. And the debt coverage ratio is a measure of how easily the district can afford to pay for its debt service. It's a very important metric in order to be able to qualify for debt, period, and more importantly, to qualify for low interest debt, and to get a good credit rating. Generally, the minimum number is 1.2. 1.5 is considered healthy, and 2.0 is considered very healthy. So that's a number we want to try to maintain in order to ensure that the district gets as low of an interest rate as possible. So moving on to scenario 2 for ORY, you can see in red, this is that same list as a couple slides ago, but it's identifying a series of projects that would either be deferred or reduced. So of the 27 million, 28 million, 3.8 million would be deferred or reduced. And I'm not sure how familiar the board is with these specific projects, but you can tell by the names are pretty descriptive. But when we were asking you to make the decision between scenario 1 and scenario 2, this is really the decision that's being made of are you comfortable with putting off some of these projects that have been identified as needs for the district.
So,
No, don't apologize.
it hit me on the last slide. Can you go back to that one, I'm sorry, with the green and the blue? So I think earlier you mentioned that our expenses are what drives the rate increase.
Partially.
It seems like what you've set up there with the bar graphs with the dark blue stripe and then the light blue, if I'm understanding correctly, the darker green on top of that is a 10% increase. It's quite a bit higher than the operating expense, debt service, and cash capital.
It is, yes.
So
In some years.
in that situation, then are you thinking that part of our expenses are reserves? Is that what we're looking
Yeah,
at?
and you can see the trend here. So in the years where the expenses are higher in 26 and 27, the columns are higher.
Yeah.
You can see down here, the green line is dropping.
Yeah.
So that represents a deficit year where you're drawing down in your reserves. And then it's pretty even in 28, 29, and then starting in 2030, you can, as you pointed out, 29, 30, you can see that the reserve or the revenues are higher than the expenses, and that's when your reserves start to recover and start working their way back up to that target line, which is a it's an ambitious reserve target, so we're not trying to get there overnight.
And then it's up to the board how steep that green wedge
That's right.
is gonna be.
That's right.
Thank you.
I would just ask the follow-up question is, well, we're doing a 5-year rate study, goes into effect 25, 26, 24, 25, rather,
Right.
24, 25.
Yeah.
So by the time you get out to 2033, it's a whole new ballgame. So your forecast is just wishful thinking in a particular way. I'm not discounting your science.
I understand.
I'm just trying to say, you do a rate study in 5 years, we may have additional costs. There's going to be other adjustments.
Right.
That is a projection that is subject to change. So I'm just trying to make sure everybody understands that.
Right.
We're not going to get there.
It's a very fair point. And I think the point of showing 10 years when you're only acting on 5 is to show with a trend. of what
Absolutely.
And what you can see is that the trend in that last year, so 2028 would be the last year. The trend is that with only a 3% rate increase, which is basically inflation, you're trending in the direction where you're now going to start recovering. So if I were to cut it off at 2028 and say, okay, this is where I'm leaving you. I'm leaving you with minimum reserves. You'd say, well, what good has, this, it hasn't gotten us anywhere where we started. But you haven't, because where you started is that you're in a situation where you can't afford your your current capital spending needs. And so we're basically suppressing capital spending right now in order to make it fit. And then over time, we're raising rates so that you can transition into a more proactive capital spending program that's gonna allow you to be better stewards to the
Correct.
infrastructure.
And, but the whole point is too, at the end of this 5 years, if we're not in the capital reserves to the place that we can't follow the trend for the next 5 years.
Sure.
It's not that it is a wrong decision that we're making today.
Right.
It is not that we are saying to our ratepayers, we're gonna accomplish all of this in 10 years.
Right.
It is a trend, so I thank you for making that clearer
Right.
for the audience. And Director Moore.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but approximately 5 years from now, this board and you or someone very much like you will be making a very similar presentation, except that you will know what happened over the past 5 years to inflation, and you will know what happened over the past 5 years to our growth and to negotiations with our employees over compensation and all of those various things that roll into some new situation that we'll see 5 years from now. We'll go through the same process again.
That's right.
Okay.
And, I'm in this job for the long term. I'm not, a fly-by-night operation. So I very much want to come back here in 5 years and say, look at all the correct projections we made, look at all the good planning we did. We only need 3% rate increases, we're right on plan.
We're on.
Right, so I've got no reason to try to manipulate this picture and, make it look rosier or worse than it is, because I want to be able to look back in 5 years and say, it happened exactly the way we planned it.
And never forget your mark.
That's.
Director Cortez, any questions?
No, I'm still trying to understand everything, so I think I might have to wait till the end. That's
Okay,
it, that's all it said.
okay, I'm gonna ask, are we on the next slide, the one with the red lines that move things to the right? Taking things out of the budget. So taking these things out of the budget to our staff is these are projects we've identified that are least likely to be in a crisis in the next 5 years. That's why we've said we can delay tackling. Are you on page 17 with me?
Number, yeah.
So staff has gone through that. Okay, I'm just trying to make sure that everybody's doing their part.
And I mean, to be clear for this scenario too, it's not just deferring these projects. It's a completely different approach to how much you're going to spend year after year. Because if we just defer $3.8 million for 5 years, and then we jump up to the scenario 1 level, you're gonna need the same rate increases. They're just gonna be a little bit later.
Later in time.
This represents permanently spending less every year. So it's just it's a lower level of reinvestment on a year in, year out basis. So I want to be clear about that.
So using that same logic, I'm still trying to figure out how we got from the original 9.1 down to the 5.6.
Mhm.
If you're using the logic right now from, 5.6 to 3.8, from scenario 1 to scenario 2,
Right,
right? There's changes, right? Not just kind of deferring, it's kind of like the strategic change in the districts of how we replace things R&R.
Mhm.
So how did we go from 9.1 down to 5.6? Like there must have been a lot of fat that we cut somewhere, right? So, or is it just the original target was just kind of like an ideal R&R and the 5.6 is actually,
yeah, so these projects here, I think that's a good way to describe it. That's an ideal, when you allow engineers to assess the system and say, what do we need? They're going to give you a complete answer and say, these are all the things that we could do.
Okay.
And so getting it from the 9.1 down to the 5.6 was prioritizing and really looking at what needs to be done over the next 5 years, because, some things can be deferred. Of course, they can be done earlier, but it's like painting a house, sometimes you can wait a year or two.
Okay, yeah, I guess my concern right now, the way I'm moving forward in this presentation is if from the 9.1 to the 5.6, did we just start so low at the 5.6 that this will eventually catch up to us? And as we're discussing these future rate-based studies, that we're gonna have to come back and be like, it was that 9.1 we should really have considered, and not that 5.6.
Right.
So that's what that's what I'm trying to understand this.
Well, I think that's a great question for your district engineer here. How comfortable are you with the 5.6 versus the 9.1?
Well, I think, I mean, Ron can probably help out a little bit more on the financing side of things, but some of it has to do with, some of those projects got, go back one slide. Some of those projects got moved into the bond funded amount, and so that annual average then got reduced because we moved some of those projects into paying for them with a bond.
Okay.
And then, as you said, there were some of those projects where we realized that this is a good project to do, but we don't necessarily need it, the susceptibility of failure, you know, and then by extension, you know, as you know, when you replace something that failed versus replacing it preventatively, you're essentially 3 times as expensive. And so we looked at those, you know, we used those metrics to assess some of the projects. And, you know, Jim Crowley, my CIP consultant, and I went through all of this and we reiterated back and forth to come up with these scenarios to make sure that it was for scenario 1, a CIP that was comprehensive enough, but not ideal, I guess would be a great, to use your word.
Not overly burdensome on the.
Yes, and yeah.
So by taking the capital plan and shifting it just a little bit, we still maintain the tempo. We know that we have the manpower resources to complete what we have. Because this R&R program, also, I know it's hard, behind it is also capacity fee projects and those bond projects. So it all marries in. So that $4 million shifts, it shifts time, but it also shifts funding.
So basically what's connecting this is that bond.
Yes.
Okay, all right.
So if we were to go with scenario 2 and defer these projects, you'd be able to bump those rates down to 88863 as opposed to the 1066. And this would be $4.8 million per year, which is $800,000 less per year in capital spending. But really the same outcome, you know, 2029 is when you really start turning things around and start rebuilding the reserves. So it's just the difference between these two scenarios is a bit higher risk for scenario 2 in terms of pushing your infrastructure a bit more to see how much more you can get out of it, and the risk being that you might have catastrophic failure or something and you need to replace it immediately, which ends up being significantly more expensive than if you had caught it before it failed.
Yes, Director Moore.
So since we're talking about $20 million bond, and that some of these projects are to be funded by the bond funding, to what extent can we postpone the borrowing, do the projects that aren't based on bond funding? The reason I ask the question is, right now, interest rates are fairly high. We keep hearing forecasts saying they're gonna come down. And obviously, the lower the interest rates are at the time we pull the trigger on bond funding, the less we burden our ratepayers with interest costs.
Unfortunately, that from a financial standpoint, that's not really an option, or at least it's a very difficult option. Because you can see the trends of the reserves that are dropping down, and this is with the bond financing. So if you were to try to cash finance those projects, then, you know, you would go below the red almost immediately if you tried to deliver the same number of projects. So if you try to do cash only, you'd have to defer the projects even more.
Well, yeah, I'm talking about the bond funded projects. To
Right.
what extent can we defer some of these projects later in the year or next year? Try and time when we do the borrow.
It's a good point, you know, interest rates are not great right now. I mean, silver lining is that you can always refinance, you know, it's a pretty common thing where you, you know, there's some costs associated with that, but you can take advantage of lower rates when they come, you know, you're not stuck with that high rates for the next 30 years. And refinancing is a pretty common thing amongst my clients, you know, they take advantage of that. Because you can save your customers millions of dollars when you do so, but.
So 2 points, Tom, so we limited borrowing to 20 million, even though the bonding capacity currently in the district's around 40 million. With that thought in mind, I don't want to overburden the district as we're moving out, right? Because this is kind of I was equating it to payday lending. We're having to borrow to do the normal work of the business, and I don't want to borrow too much so we get stuck in a cycle. But to the point, Ord is not our problem child, right? Marina, we're funding a lot of Marina's capital on bonds, and that work has to get done. So Ord gets the benefit by not impacting its capital program so much, and we can continue forward on a good pace. But it's Marina that's driving a lot of the lending decision, because we're using the bond to fund all of the R&R for the first 3 years.
And Central Marina's issue is because
The rates are so low and we haven't invested in its capital. So it's suffering from
we have some old infrastructure.
from old infrastructure and the need to start getting in and repairing it, and the fact that our capital program, Marina wasn't really driving hard enough to replace over time.
Well, last I checked, staff for the last 25, 30 years has been a little occupied with the farm floor.
And our rates were, and our capital program was predicated on $600,000 a year over 4 cost centers. So, you know, and to the point, I mean, the district was leaning into the fact that the infrastructure was operating. And so our O&M's credit, you know, we've been a little baling wire and duct tape. And we're now moving out of that space into a more professional space.
But obviously you've been buying good duct tape.
Only to find
nice permanent fixes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Along those lines, with the deferred, you mentioned on page 17, those 3.8 million deferred. How much of that deferred portion of those projects were in the bond funded R&R?
None.
None. Okay.
So that's a good point. The 2 scenarios, the debt financing doesn't change. You know, there was a million different ways to cut this. I thought that one way to keep it simple is that both scenarios have the same amount of debt financing, because really, in terms of your rates over the next 5 years, that the size of that bond doesn't affect it tremendously. So.
Question?
Okay, so moving on to Marina Water. So again, that kind of simple snapshot of what the way things stand during the current fiscal year. There's $5.3 million in cash reserves. Revenues are 4.9 million, operating budget and debt are 5.5 million. And so this shows you that Marina, this is the only cost center that has the situation, is actually already in a deficit. So it does not have any, it can't afford its operating and debt. So it certainly doesn't have any money to spend on capital. And so that's what you'll see, that Marina is requiring larger rate increases than the other cost centers. And it's also going to require, relatively speaking, more debt. So here's the list of projects for scenario 1. So same situation where a portion of this is being bond financed. So let me back up here to remind myself. So the debt being issued from Marina Water is $5.2 million. And so the leftover number here is 2.3. So about $3 million in debt to pay for R&R projects. And here are the rate increases that would be required for scenario one. So this would be spending $1.6 million per year, compared to the original target of 3.8 million. It would be 20% rate increases for 3 years, and then 8 and 8. And then in the out years, it would be 5% rate increases to continue the trend to get the reserves reestablished.
But they're big percentages. Director Moore.
Yeah.
Looking at the scenario one, Marina Water. At reservoir to Andrew Garrison, isn't that all on the former corridor? So why is that part of Marina's capital spend?
Yeah, I
I'm
don't
not gonna try and answer that.
know. Yeah, B res is forward, D res is north, F res is north, Air Harrison north, B and C zone is north.
Is there's, so are the amounts shown there, the amounts for those actual projects, or are they simply a portion shared amongst different cost centers for that project?
They're shared across cost centers.
So these are percentages of the total cost.
No. So we just want to make sure that well, at least articulate to the public how those shares were calculated, so that they would view that's okay, that's our fair share of this project.
Go ahead,
Good,
Vice
sorry.
President Schreiner.
Just because I
Go ahead.
apologize. I suspect if we do approve a 20% rate increase over several years for Central Marina, we will hear about it from the public.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up with, staff, so on page 17, where we're looking at some of the old water deferred, they have very similar names to some of the line items on page 23 that are not marked as deferred, like, for example, the D reservoir redundant fill line is possibly deferred on page 17, but it's not possibly deferred on page 23. So maybe there's, an explanation of why it needs to be. Maybe it's not a physical thing, maybe it's a planning thing, I don't really know. And thank you whoever put the page numbers on it, I really appreciate page numbers for discussion.
So I think someone's looking for an answer.
Yeah.
May I take Director Inman Moore's question? Go ahead.
Just a question.
Yeah.
So, was this scenario, a lot of it based upon a lot of, deferred movement over the years?
Yeah.
So this is maybe something that maybe previously, you know, the shoulda, woulda, coulda been addressed back then, and then you wouldn't have such a big spike.
Oh, I think that, you know, our past practice was to, and you have to remember that the district was being overseen by Flora and was driving a lot of the district's decisions, so the district wasn't, if I speak out of turn, you guys please tell me, but
Yeah, that's all.
there was another entity driving kind of the decisions that were happening, so when you take $600,000 for all of the infrastructure that we should have been doing, and you parse it out over the 4 cost centers, it doesn't go very far. And so now that Flora's not on top of us and we're actually free and clear to make the make better decisions or make more appropriate decisions or make more focused decisions, we're able to start identifying projects and moving them forward.
Right, so without taking into account what restrictions were in the past or whatever,
Right.
this is a good lesson for the future that we need to deal with these right away, otherwise we're gonna get what you see right now.
Absolutely, and I think you'll, to that point, Director Nomura, when we get to Ord Sewer, you will see our most healthy cost center, and you'll see that everything's right. It's tuned perfectly, it's running great. And so that's where, to our earlier conversation, that's where we want to be in terms of all the cost centers, right? 5 years from now, I would like to be able to sit here with you guys and with Mark and staff and be able to say, we planned out this 5 years. Rates are, we had to do this little rough work in the beginning, yes. And it got us to here, and now everything is, I wish that it will all be, whatever inflation is, but that's pretty much it in a nutshell. But so I think to your point, yes, there's a considerable amount of deferred maintenance in the system, and we're trying to take care of it in a measured and controlled way, so as not to hurt our customers, but at the same time, replace our infrastructure without having to do it on the fly and in the most expensive condition.
Yeah, unfortunately, due to the timing, because of inflation and everything, it just exacerbates everything, so,
Yeah.
but it is what it is.
I mean, I do also want to, along the lines of the questions that are being asked, this district is uniquely complicated. I've worked with probably almost 100 utilities in my career, and having a utility that manages two different systems in two different areas, but manages them together is a huge challenge in terms of being able to coordinate the work being done in one area as well as the other, and the overlay of benefits and costs and whatnot. And so I can appreciate the questions about, aligning the different projects, and I can assure you that by the time we're done, it will all be buttoned up. But it's possible that there's a place here and there where we haven't completely lined up the cost centers and the costs, the deferring one project here, but not in the other cost center. But you'll certainly get into things. So on the marine water, for scenario 2, what's interesting about this one is that the capital spending is already quite low, because marine water is in the toughest position in terms of rate increases. And so I think that pencil has to be sharpened. Although the cost centers are being treated equitably, we had to be vigilant with marine water to make sure we kept the capital spending as minimal as possible. And the other thing that had to be done is that we, proportionately speaking, more of the capital projects had to be debt financed. And so that's why for scenario 2, there's not as many projects that are being deferred, because there's more projects that fall under the bond financing. And so since the bond financing doesn't change between scenario 1 and 2, we don't need to defer as much on the pay-go side in order to get lower rates. So we're really just talking about tank B1 and reservoir C1. And that lowers rates to 17% for 3 years, followed by 2 8%.
And just the debt financed for marina water, more reliance on debt finance because the work is more urgent.
Correct. And so if you look at the chart, President Schreiner, or President Warren, you'll see that
I've been called every name except for
too much stuff going on, man. We're not spending on capital in the first 3 years at all. It's all debt finance,
because we don't have it,
because we don't have cash.
right?
Yeah, we just don't have the cash. You can see that we're on that minimum reserve line, and we're not doing any pay-go at all until 2028. So deferring more projects wouldn't do anything, because you're already not doing any pay-go in those 4 years.
Vice President Schreiner and then Director Moore.
On the first, column there, fiscal year 2023, there's light blue capital, but it's gone. For the next 3 or 4.
This fiscal 23 was last year, so it's
It's
just,
spent down.
yeah, that's already been spent.
Yeah.
Director Moore?
So I have a feeling the answer to my question is going to be no, but in the past, the board has talked about possibility of using reserves from one cost center to actually lend with a reasonable interest rate, but not necessarily as high as the bond market, lend to another cost center so that infrastructure projects have it. Are we in a position to do any of that amongst these 4 would Central Marina's water borrow from Board Waters reserves temporarily? That just doesn't, it's a zero-sum game.
Technically, it's something that happens. I can't speak to whether or not the district wants to do that or is in a position to do that, but it is, as long as a fair interest rate is paid between cost centers, then it technically can be done, but I'll defer.
Well, I think it's safe to say, if we go and we look at the front charts, we demonstrated that that's not really available to us, because it's all of us, right? The only cost center that is healthy is Ord Sewer. And it's not healthy enough to carry $20 million like the other entities are running, right? And specifically, it couldn't carry $2 million for Marina Water. But we are aware, and it was part of our thought process to see, okay, do I really need to borrow 20? Can I borrow 15 and pull 5 from somebody else and debt finance that way? Because then I can control the debt. We just don't have that kind of debt.
How did I ask the question?
No, it's a great question. It's good to take it off there. Because I'd love to be able to do it.
Right.
Okay, switching over to the sewer cost centers, first Marina Sewer. The snapshot here is that it's about $650,000 in reserves. Revenues is 1.6 million, operating budget and debt is 1.2, which leaves us with about $500,000 a year for capital spending. Here's the list of projects for scenario 1, which amounts to $6 million. Which is $1.2 million per year. And you can see in this case, we don't, it's similar to Marina Water in the sense that we're not spending any money in cash. We're not doing any pay-go for the first 3 years in this case, not the first 4, but for the first 3 years, we're not spending any money on cash, because you can see the reserves get quite close to 0 in 2024, and then they start to recover, and then starting in 2027 is when we're able to start cash financing capital projects again. So in this case, we require 15% rate increases for 3 years, and then 2 10% rate increases. So both the marinas are similar in the sense that they're in a tighter spot in terms of their reserves and the need to issue more debt in order to get through the next few years, and generally need higher rate increases in order to get to a place where they can afford to pay for their capital without issuing more debt.
Oh, I'm sorry, Director Cortez.
Yes. Can you go over that, what that statement you mean about pay-go, that we don't pay-go for the first 3 years? I'm just trying to look at this chart. I'm trying to figure out where does pay-go. That's
So, pay-go is the blue on the very top.
So if we're not funding, so it doesn't have, we don't start funding until we go.
There's no blue.
That's what it means.
So that means that we're debt financing the capital. It doesn't mean that we're not doing capital projects. It means that we're not. Whether we are debt funding.
So for I think it's a good question for the benefit of the larger audience. So you can see that For capital, you can either pay more debt, which is spread out over a longer time, or you can pay go, which is you can pay in cash. You can see for the first 3 years, we're issuing more debt. You can see the debt increase from 24 to 25. The stripes blue jumps, it about doubles from 24 to 25. That's because of the issuance of the debt portion that's going to pay for 3 years of capital projects for marina sewer. And then starting in 2027, now you're in a position where your revenues are high enough and your reserves are strong enough that you can start paying cash for those capital projects. So you can see the debt doesn't increase anymore. You're not issuing any more debt. And you can see the debt amounts down here at the very bottom. You're paying $1 million in 25, 26, and 27. Which will help pay for capital during those years.
But in that situation where you have a light green or a darker green wedge over 24 and 25, isn't that also showing cash going into the reserve? Ideally, that there's no emergency thing that you spend money on, but if you are light green and your dark green are higher than your bar, isn't that your reserve or your cash extra?
So, yeah, so if the background is higher than the foreground columns, and that's a surplus here where you're building your reserves.
Yeah.
You can see that reserve building there.
Then when does that building of reserve switch to being a blue bar in your mind? Like how does it, what's the transaction that makes it a blue bar, light blue bar?
The light blue bar?
Yeah.
This represents, cash funded capital in that year. So that would be about $1.2 million in capital spending that year.
So first it's going into reserve, going into reserve, going into reserve, and then it's capital expenditure.
That's right. That's right.
But it's only spent after you fully fund your reserves. That's the problem.
Yeah, okay.
We're not fully funding our reserves. We just did our policy on reserves.
Yeah.
So it's, the distance from here to here is, I'm just estimating, is about $500,000. So here you set aside $500,000 in reserves, or you had set aside, $200,000 or $300,000 in reserves, and then here you actually drew down in your reserves by about $400,000. And so that's that dip right there. You can see it's a $400,000 drop, and then it stays pretty even for the rest of the forecast.
Thank you.
So just to clarify, just so I'm understanding. So once we hit the reserve in 2027, that's where we're now eligible to do things for capital? Is that what that's saying? Just what Director, Vice President Schreier was saying. So we don't do the cash capital, we don't get to activate cash capital until we have a fully reserve, until we've met our reserves? Is that what that says?
You don't want to, in this case, you're trying to find a balance of what you can do, right? So in this case, we are allowing, in 2027, for example, we're allowing you to have a deficit year because your reserves are healthy enough that you can survive a year where you have a $500,000 deficit. If in 2027, your projected reserve level is at the red line, I would never recommend that you, or suggest that you, spend more than you have, because that would pull your reserve levels down to below the minimum level. But in this case, you have enough of a buffer that you can survive. You could do that. Another option would have been to issue a bit more debt and get your reserves even higher, but we're just trying to find the right balance of issuing debt and establishing good reserves.
But, go ahead.
So just for clarity, when we talk about reserves in this conversation, are we only talking about reserve money for capital infrastructure projects, or are we talking about total amount of reserve within that cost?
Only for R&R projects. So this does not include your capacity charge reserves, which are reserves that are restricted for growth related projects and are not part of this.
What about operating reserve?
That's part of this.
So operating reserves are part of this.
Correct.
So this is all our unrestricted reserves.
Okay. So in that case, you know, what I'm hearing from my fellow directors, is the question, why, since we have these infrastructure needs, why not spend in 24, 25, 26, those reserves that we currently have and are generating from rates? Why don't we just spend that all on infrastructure within that scenario and not?
Well, those reserves are right here, they're represented by the green line. Those are all your unrestricted reserves are represented by your green line. And so you can see in 2024, your reserve level is below $1 million. So you really don't have any room.
Well, yeah, I mean, according to this, 9 months ago, it was $652,000.
Oh, there you go, that's that data point right there, that low point, that 650.
But, so we could spend $650 now. And as we have been collecting money going into reserves in the last 9 months and in the next 24 months, we could spend and have for that period of time, 0 reserves.
So that's a great question. It ties back to the debt. So if you want to qualify for a good interest rate, you need to demonstrate that you aren't drawing your reserves down to 0, that you have strong reserve policies, and that you always keep, emergency reserves. And they're going to look at your history and say, how low are you drawing? How responsible are you being with your reserves? Are you drawing down to 0? And that's going to affect your interest rate if you draw your reserves down too low.
Sorry.
So I was gonna call on Mary. Didn't we just approve our reserve policies and set those levels, correct?
Yes.
And so, Mark, on your graph, every time you show us that dotted line, that is based on the adopted
Right.
reserve policy.
Right.
So those monies are not there to use for R&R capital improvement projects. Those are reserves so that we have our 18 months of operating expenses. Should something catastrophic happen, we can still pay salaries, we can still operate, keep everything pumping and the sewer going to where it's supposed to go, right?
And then I was just gonna say, if you can see 24, it's really low, our reserves. 24, 25, 26, we're trying to build our reserves. But at the same time, we're still doing capital infrastructure through bond financing. And then once we build our reserves a little bit, acceptable, then we start the light blue where we are doing capital infrastructure using paygo money. So that's the red is really
Critical.
critical. We don't want to go.
We don't want to go below the red.
When I think to Tom's point, though, we, in 27, we spend down some of those reserves to slow out our pitch, right? So we're trying not to use, bond financing. I'm really trying very hard to stay away from credit. I don't like borrowing if I can help it. So we get ourselves a little bit of steam, we cut the steam a little bit, and then we continue to pitch out. But they show that we have we're on a recovery trend. Every single one of these will show that we're on a recovery trend. That's one of the things that was important.
So one follow-up question. So the green line in the lower graph shows a significant decrease from 2023 to 2024.
Yeah, I was just noticing that what's missing is the, similar to the block back here, there was actual capital spending that happened in 2023. And it appears to be missing from the graph here. So there was actual capital spending that happened in 2023 that resulted in the drop that you see in the green line.
Out of reserves.
Out of reserves.
Got it. Okay.
So there was another light blue box.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's missing the light blue box in 2023.
Very observant, Director.
Very observant.
The details matter sometimes.
Yeah.
Always.
I actually have it written right here before you said anything. It's like, okay, so for Marina Sewer, here are the deferred projects for scenario 2. You can see it's a total of $800,000. on a variety of different projects. And that would get us down to 11% per year for 3 years and then 10% for 2 years. And it would be $1 million in capital spending per year as opposed to 1.2 for scenario 1.
Still steep.
Okay, Ord Sewer. Snapshot for Ord Sewer. As I mentioned before, Ord Sewer is one of the few cost centers that is in pretty good shape. The reserves are 4.3 million, revenues are just over 5 million. Operating budget and debt are just under 3 million. So the leftover for R&R Tego is over $2 million per year. Scenario 1 identifies about $13 million in capital projects as listed here. And the rate increases are quite modest, just 4% per year in this scenario. And that would allow you to spend $2.6 million, which is actually slightly higher than the original target of 2.5, so pretty much the same. This scenario basically allows you to spend the money that was originally identified by the district engineering team. And then for scenario 2, there's the bottom line there, condition assessment related projects are basically this cost center. One of the things that needs to be done by the engineering group is to go out and do more condition assessments to truly understand what the needs are. And so in the previous line, we had $4 million of projects that would be identified by better understanding the condition of the system. And so if we removed that $4 million and pretended that we go out there and look and everything's fine, then you could get the spending down to $8 million. And then the rates would drop to 3% per year.
I'm gonna ask the question. Why would you do that?
And that this is not coming from the engineer. This was just my interpretation of, I had to put it in my own words.
Okay.
At the last minute, because we were putting this together for the last week, and yesterday I realized I had to explain that drop in capital spending, so I didn't want to pretend those words came from the engineer because that wouldn't be fair. That was my interpretation of what was the decision was. So maybe you can put it in better words than that.
No, I think we're in the right spot.
I think we're in the right spot. I'm understanding this to mean this is the Ord sewer, that we have an old system that we got from the Army.
Yes.
We, half the time, there's something on our agenda to approve because we have found there's a pipe that doesn't connect someplace, or there's a catastrophic,
Or there's no pipe.
right, there's no pipe, which is the same thing as a catastrophic hole. And the point is, in this scenario too, I mean, scenario 1, that you're ending up with a 4% cost increase and you're able, 4% revenue increase, and you are able to actually be prepared for what we know inherently, that the Army system and infrastructure is either not there, about to break, or already broken, and we just haven't been injured yet. Why we would even consider, why did we even have Mark go through the exercise of scenario 2? For the purpose of discussion only.
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to confirm.
Yeah.
Okay, so I get where you're coming from, Mark. You gave us the discussion to drop it to 3%, and then we still have this part that we haven't unraveled
Correct.
to really figure it out.
Strategically, right? So we brought the possum. Derek and his crew showed you that it's there. That is now operating, and we're now doing condition assessment on this infrastructure. And so there is there is an unknown need out there. I mean, we all know it.
Yeah,
So the thing is that now we have the tools to do it. We're starting to identify pieces that need to be repaired. This is fully within the boundaries of good engineering, to make sure that not only do the crews have revenue, but the capital program has revenue to repair and replace the infrastructure.
once you find the difficulty, fix it.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I just,
Director Moore, I think that's I really like the way you phrase that because it gets back to Director Moore's point earlier of, so, 10 years ago, we made a decision to not raise rates, and that's why we find ourselves in this whole, you could look at exactly the same situation where it's like, well, can we save 1% and not deal with those projects that we don't know about because we're hoping that they're actually fine? And you can see it adds up, over the course of 10 years, that's a 10% rate increase compounded, that's 12%. And so if you were to just go with the 3% rate increase and not deal with those unidentified projects, then 10 years from now, you'd be looking at a 12% rate spike in your face because now those projects have come home to roost, so to speak. So it's very similar.
right, and the other place that you would get it is in the reserve, that green line reserve, because it's catastrophic and you have to do it right today.
That's right.
So you would be not keeping your reserve, you would not achieve that goal in the reserve policy either. Director Moore.
So I just want to comment and compliment staff on getting that new piece of machinery that allows
Rover.
you to run a robot into the wastewater system and actually see what's there. And the reason I'm really grateful for that, the public ought to know, former Fort Ord is every bit as old as the Naval Postgraduate School. And 6 or 8 years ago, a gentleman came out to his car in the parking lot and found one wheel had gone 1.5 feet into the pavement of the parking lot. So they had to tow the car out of the hole. When they looked in the hole, what they found was a redwood sewer pipe, 100+ years old, that had finally given way carrying wastewater. I hope we don't find any redwood sewer pipes in our system, but I'm
Do you want to
sure
regale them on Co Avenue? Nope.
It's
Well,
just
that
dirt.
that was the wastewater 30-inch no pipe, yeah. It was a concrete pipe that the sulfides completely heated the pipe and there was no pipe, not even a bottom left. So that was that emergency, well, it's been like 3.5 years ago. I'm very confident there is no redwood pipe out there.
Well,
we
we'll
do have,
answer to that.
just from what I've seen, they already did some weird stuff, but I don't think at least in our boundaries, there's any redwood pipe. But we have a lot of clay pipe, and that's the issue that we see. Roots, cracks, bellies, settling, that type of stuff. That's what we're gonna find the majority of in the Ord system. I'm sure.
And you're gonna replace with new plastic, right?
Yes, SDR,
And what's the lifetime of that stuff?
about 70 years.
Yeah, well, we book it at 70, but it'll do 100.
Okay.
Thank you for letting us have this discussion, Mark.
So the whole, recycled water, is a little bit more straightforward. It's a brand new fund, so that's why it has such low reserves. The revenues are 1.3, costs are about 1 million, and so there's about 300,000 left over for paygo. Recycled water is a little unique because some of its costs in the short term can be kind of bolstered by the existence of the capacity charge funds, which was paid for by the sole customer that you currently have. And so that can be used to pay for the debt service. And so the pink is the additional color you see in this column, and that's the use of the capacity charge revenue in the first few years to help pay for debt service and to build up the reserves. And you can see the reserves go well above the target until 2030. And in 2030, there's one massive capital project. And this is the direct potable reuse project that's being proposed. It's a $170 million project that would be mostly grant funded, but it's anticipated that if that project were to go forward, the district would have to come up with about $12 million to pay for that project, to just get it started. And then you receive federal grant money for the balance. So the blue there, that blue block represents about $6 million in cash. And then the other half would be debt financed. So we're kind of looking for a balance where we could build reserves over time to help, try to cash finance as much as possible. And then whatever wasn't possible to cash finance, we were going to issue another $4 million bond, looks like $4.4 million.
Director Moore.
So early on, the pink area, we show collecting capacity charges. But am I correct in assuming that our single one customer has fully paid its capacity charge at this point in time?
That's correct. That's using the money that they paid.
We're using it up.
So you have $7 million in that fund from that one customer. And this is the district drawing it down. So this is actually an expense.
Those are expenditures, not.
Well, it's a revenue, since the background is a revenue, so it's a source of funds. So you're basically drawing down on that fund, on the $7 million that has already been paid.
Oh, I thought the pink was showing revenue that we were getting each year.
It's treating that as a source of revenue. It's basically an outside source because all the other funds don't consider capacity charges. So I'm treating that as an outside source of revenue that you're drawing into the operating funds to help pay for debt.
We do appreciate the fact that Mary is now getting 5% on those revenues.
Yeah, commission.
How she wishes.
Any other questions?
So this disclaimer is actually from the last presentation, so I'll just skip over it. So going into process service and rate design. So what does this all mean? As we mentioned earlier, or during the last presentation, for your water rates, you're currently charging a fixed service charge based on meter size and tiered consumption rates. So all customers receive 10 HCF or 748 gallons per HCF of tier 1 water, and then the rest tier 2 water rates. We are proposing that we start charging a uniform rate to commercial and multifamily customers, that they no longer pay a tiered rate. And we're also proposing to increase the amount of fixed revenue that we recover through the rates. This is a graphic representation of what those rates would look like. So your tier 1 rates, basically, and most of your tier 2 rates represent basically all of the costs that the district has, except for conservation. And so you're basically breaking out your conservation costs and only charging, including that in the tier 2 rates. So you're recovering the cost of conservation through your tier 2 customers, with the idea that folks who use the most water are the ones who are driving the need for a conservation program. On the uniform side, the conservation costs would be also part of the rates, but it would be paid at a smaller unit rate across all rates, across all water. And the weighted average of the tiered rates would be equal to the uniform rate. So if you took all the water sold to single family and all the water sold to non-single family, you came up with what's the average rate paid, it'd all be exactly the same. So I have about 20 slides, and I'd like to propose that I only show, I've got 2 different sets. I've got the scenario 1 slides and I've got the scenario 2 slides. So would you like to see the rates in the form of the scenario 1 or scenario 2?
What's the difference between the scenarios?
Scenario 1 was for it is 20% for marina water and 17%. Scenario 1 was 20% and scenario 2 was 17%. So scenario 1 is the higher rates and scenario 2 is the lower rates. It would have just been too many slides to show it all.
Which do you want?
Scenario 1.
You want scenario 1? Okay, let's do scenario 1, and then if we can't afford it, we'll look at scenario 2.
Okay. So first, the shift in fixed versus variable. We currently recover about 50%
I do have a question. To what extent are the multifamily and non-residential on 1 inch or larger meters?
Very few. They're predominantly on 5/8 or 3/4 inch meters. And I can pull up the actual
Multifamily?
Oh, multifamily, there's quite a few that are above, because depending on the size of the apartment. I'm sorry, I thought you said just single family.
No, multifamily.
Okay.
And non-residential.
Okay.
Wait, are there many who are on 5/8 or 1 inch meters?
We're doing ore water right now, ore water. Sorry, wasn't planning on showing this, but I can show you the breakdown. So multifamily, there's 2,127 that are the smallest size meter. There's 278 that are 1 inch, 23 that are 1.5, 24 that are 2 inch, and 7 that are 3 inch. Oh, and then there's a couple that are 8 inch. Some really large apartments.
So in terms of numbers, most of them are 1 inch or,
Correct. The vast majority are the smallest meter size.
I'm guessing those are mostly non-residential.
Oh, so those numbers I just showed you were all multifamily. For commercial, here's the number. I don't know if you can, I'm not sharing the screen. Sorry, I was like talking about it.
Yeah.
It's not, all right. Okay, new share. Let me share this. There we go. Okay. So I was wondering why you weren't looking at the screen. You're just nervous. Okay. So there's multifamily across the different meter sizes across the top there. So you can see the vast majority are the smallest meter size, and then there's a handful that are, or there's about almost 300 that are 1 inch, et cetera. And then commercial, institutional, industrial, it's pretty spread out across those middle size meters.
So I'm trying to, that's 2,000 multifamily with 5/8.
Well, because they include duplexes, there's a lot of.
There's a lot of duplexes in the org.
So this resolves the issue that habitually the multifamilies push straight into tier 2. Because they go right through that 10 ACF, so they're burdened by the higher cost disproportionately, they're burdened by the higher costs created by tier 2. So there's a way for us to smooth that over.
That makes sense.
Do we have any plans to convert those duplexes to 2 separate meters? in order to try and deliver the bill more closely to the people who are performing the use of the water.
If the customer wishes to give us the $13,000 it costs for the meter, and we're happy to set another meter.
Well, it's because you have to run a new lateral?
Well, it's capacity, right?
It's
We
a
can't,
capacity.
Oh,
we
right,
can't
right,
break the capacity on the
Okay.
meter. If we break the capacity on the meter, that we have to have 2 meters.
It's true, but if, maybe it's a little off topic, but if we wanted to drive more water conservation in the Ord community, you'd want to drive meters towards those who actually control the use of the water. But I'm not sure I see why we'd have to charge an additional capacity charge, because the same line would come off the main to serve those 2 meters, and the water usage behavior would not be changing.
We track capacity to the parcel through the meter.
I get that, but
Okay.
couldn't the board, if it made sense, the board could make an exception for those single meter duplexes on the Ord community, but it's,
Okay, so I want to bring the topic back to where we are, because that
yes.
is
it's
a whole
different-
philosophical question, a policy question, and
Yep, yep, yep,
an agenda item, if somebody wanted to do that, and I'm not suggesting today.
correct.
So to translate this rate schedule into what would this look like on an actual bill, which I think was a question that was brought up earlier. Here's the bill impact. So what this does is that it translates all those changes to the rates to how this affects different types of customers. And so for single family, we have a low water user, a median water user, and an average water user of 3 HCF, 5 HCF, and 6 HCF. It shows what their current bill is, what the proposed bill is, and what the change to their bill is.
Question. So that bill, so then what's in that bill is the water, the cost for the water,
That's right,
and then the standard meter fee.
that's right,
Okay, so those 2 items.
right,
Okay.
that's right. And then for multifamily, I've got different size meters, which sort of represent different size complexes and sort of typical average water use by those, size meters. And then different non-residential examples with small meters and large meters and different water uses. You can see one of the trends that you can see is that the largest water users, the 50, all the largest water users are actually seeing decreases in their bill, and that's because their water use is a bigger part of their bill than their meter charge. And so that decrease that I mentioned that we'll be getting from going from the tiered rates where they were effectively paying $7.70, they're going down to $7.39, that the largest water users are going to be more affected by that than smaller water users.
These are going to be, HOAs, ball fields, what are those?
Yeah, I mean, some of the largest water users are irrigation accounts,
Yeah.
for sure, schools and institutions,
Okay.
larger facilities like that are gonna be your largest water users.
Okay.
Large apartments,
Okay. So the business community and maybe some of the schools,
right,
out of Ord.
yeah, I'm sure CSU is in there.
And I'm sorry, can you back up a bit I wanna see the 6-inch meter size, and you had it on a different, I think you had it on your own computer maybe, the different accounts that
Oh,
were
how many,
different
how
size.
many are out there?
Yeah, the 6-inch.
There's only one 6-inch customer,
Okay,
but there's 4 8-inch customers.
okay. There's not a huge number of customers, in those people who would be getting their bills even to less than what they are now.
Okay. So that's Ord water, year one, bill and text. Marina water,
Can we do Ord sewer?
oh yeah, jump to Ord water.
Why not look at the customer in its totality, is
Okay,
kind of where I'm headed. Is that okay, Director Cortez? Director Moore?
So I would like to point something out on wood water. This would effectively have a decrease for those multifamily and non-residential unit bills. Politically, I could see a large chunk of our customers who pay single-family bills, questioning why that, and raising the issue in a way that says, oh, the board is giving these for-profit organizations, these landlords, et cetera, some kind of benefit here. On the other hand, if there were a way to leave their bills the same, not increase them, but not decrease them, and that were legal and fair, I could also see some of those landlords being unhappy now that we've articulated this.
Right.
And I wouldn't want to see us engaged in any more litigation.
Right.
So my point is, whatever the board arrives at, we're going to need some really, really clear articulation of whatever it is we arrive at and the justifications for it. Because we're gonna have to sell these increases to our customers. Yeah. In this environment, I don't want us to believe that that's just going to be an easy task.
Right.
And I'm not saying we can't get these passed, but we owe a really solid explanation to our customers. And I know you're trying to do this with these sessions and bring the public in, but we may need to reach out to our public affairs organization to help us even more with this.
Stick with marina water. Your slides have other explanations.
Right.
Go right ahead. Go. Sorry.
Okay,
I'm trying to put them together on a concise,
I'm happy to do it either way.
do it your way.
Okay. But just to Director Moore's point, it's a really good point, and I just want to reiterate that, maybe not reiterate, iterate that I never want to make a change for the sake of making a change. I think change is very difficult, right? And so if a recommendation is made to change something as significant as this, it's being done for a reason. And I think, Proposition 218, the requirements for rate setting is a changing landscape. It's been evolving, particularly in the last 10 years, but over time, and as court cases come through and as we see other utilities, lose lawsuits, we learn from that. And we understand what we need to do in order to minimize your risk and to really be as defensible as possible and keep your legal bills down, to be honest, right? So that's part of what I'm here doing is even if what you're doing is currently defensible, sometimes we want to make sure that we're one step ahead of the game.
Right.
And so all these things are being done for a reason. Okay, so marina water, the tier 1 rates would increase by 50 cents and the tier 2 rates would increase by $1.10. The uniform rate would decrease by about 90 cents. The effective uniform rate versus the adopted uniform rate. And then you can see a variety of changes. In this case, you can see the meter charges are jumping pretty significantly, especially in contrast with oil water. And that's because of this shift here. So as we mentioned earlier, Ord Water currently already recovers about 50% of the revenue through their fixed revenue, which is the industry standard really moving towards recovering more costs through your fixed revenue because the district's costs are fixed. There's very few costs that are variable. And so in order to protect the district financially and to avoid the really impactful financial results of drought and that type of thing, we want to, and so Ord's already kind of at that right spot, 50-50, but Marina is currently only recovering 37% of its revenue through fixed. So we'd like to bump that up to be similar, 50-50. And as a result, you can see the monthly service charges are actually what are jumping the most, and that's why the tiered rates really, despite the fact that we're talking about 20% rate increases, you can see the tiered water rates really aren't jumping tremendously.
Question.
Yes, go ahead, Director Lamar.
This is what I'm not clear on. So the fixed charge, which is the meter charge, okay, are different from Marina and Ord.
Correct.
What's involved with what's in the meter charge? To me, a meter is a meter, okay? And I'm wondering, why would it be different in the cost?
Go ahead.
I'm gonna say, calling it meter charge really is misnomer. It's fixed cost charge. And what did you include? Well, what are marinas, this was gonna be my question anyway. What are the actual fixed charges you calculated for marine water? What percentage?
If we were to put actual fixed costs in there, I didn't run the exercise, but just based on the fact that you don't import water, it's probably 80 to 85% fixed.
So actually, the cost of experiences in this rate don't change much from one year to the next based on how much water people use. Only 20% of our costs are actually directly due to water that people use or
Electricity,
don't use.
chemicals, stuff.
Electricity, chemicals, and so forth. Our staff, raise your hand if you're on the staff and you get paid more in a year when our customers use more water. I'm not seeing any hands. So those are all fixed costs, and we're gonna recover 50% of our revenue as a fixed.
But so it's the meter, I agree, the meter charge is sort of a misnomer. We're not charging them for the meter, we're charging them for what that meter represents. And so the meter is a certain size, and that the size of your meter represents how much capacity you require to be served, because your system is, you have an entire system. And so how do you divide all the fixed costs associated with this big system amongst your customers?
Right.
The industry standard is to say, we're going to measure each customer how much capacity they require based on the size of their meter. Because in any given moment, if you have a 1-inch meter, you can turn that meter up full blast, and the district needs to be ready to serve that meter. The district is sized to serve the meters that are in the system. And so the costs of that infrastructure are attributed to the different customers based on the size of their meter, because that basically represents what their capacity needs
No,
are.
I understand different sizes, but I mean, if you got a 3/4 inch meter in the dunes, let's say, versus Central Marina, it's a meter.
Right.
And I'm getting the same capacity, and this goes with the cost of the water too.
Oh,
Why is the cost of the water different? It's kind of like if you're going into Target, and the Target person, I'm going in and buying a bag of rice. And they said, well, do you live in Central Marina or the dunes? Because that depends, that's gonna depend how much I'm gonna charge you for the bag of rice. I don't expect that. I see a price on there, the rice is gonna cost the same for everybody.
Right.
And this is the question I get, is like, why does our water cost more? Given a certain level of measurement, one HCF, they should cost the same, shouldn't they?
They should not, because it's a question of efficiencies with scale.
Okay.
What you have is you have marina water, which is a certain size, geographically speaking, number of miles of pipe, how spread out it is, how dense it is, and you have a certain number of customers in that group. And when you divide the size of the system by the number of customers, you have a smaller number than when you take Ord, which is a much, much larger system. It's much, much more spread out. It has a lot more infrastructure. And yes, it serves more customers, but relatively speaking, there's fewer customers per mile of pipe in Ord. And so it's just by nature more expensive to serve those customers. It's just the nature of a more spread out system. That's just
Okay, and this is just getting back to what Director Moore said previously. I think we're gonna have to do a lot better job of educating people to let them understand, because believe me, and in many ways, I could agree with people.
Mhm.
You're right. If I buy a cup of water, I expect it to be the same. If I'm going to whatever store or whatever, I expect them to charge the customer the same
Right.
versus where you're living or where it's, oh, well, you're gonna drink the water in this area, so we're gonna charge you more.
Yeah.
So, anyway. I'm just-
No, it's a fair point, and it is a little hard to wrap your head around. I think what we need to do is come up with a good analogy that, people can relate to in their day-to-day lives that comes with a good analogy, and I'm trying to think of one, I'm not coming up with one off the top of my head, but I'm sure there's something out there that we can help explain why the efficiencies of scale really matter in this case, and it's not because we want to charge more to a certain group of customers, just the reality of operating that system is just more per customer than the other system.
So Director Imamura raises a great question, and like the discussion we had a moment ago about language and meter charge, got a little bit of a language issue here. I'm paying my bill for water, so up until we started delivering recycled water, let me ask staff, how much each year we were pumping about 3,000 acre feet per year of groundwater. How big was the bill we got for that groundwater from God? What did we pay for that groundwater? We paid nothing. Mother Nature delivered it into the ground. So we're not paying for water. What our customers are paying for is a delivery service. We are delivering water to our customers. And guess what? The delivery system in the Org community is how many miles of pipe?
150-ish,
And the delivery system for Central Marina is,
50-ish.
okay, and the marina system is closer to our well fields, is it not? And most of our customers on the Org community are further from the well fields.
Yeah, from a distribution standpoint, correct.
Yeah, so the delivery service we're providing to Ord is a lot more expensive than the delivery service in a much more compact Central Marina urban area. All right, so not really paying for water, you're really paying for water to be delivered to your tap, clean and usable 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. I don't know if that gives you some leverage in terms of explaining things to the public, but
I like your idea of the delivery. The analogy that comes to my mind growing up as an islander, but also remembering back to the first time I went to Big Sur, and it was a long time ago, it was probably 30 years ago, the first time I went to Big Sur, but in Gorda, a hamburger was $10 30 years ago. And now I was just like, wow, I could buy the same hamburger in Santa Cruz for like $5. Why am I paying $10 in Big Sur? And then I have to remember, well, there's no cow right there, right? They gotta ship everything in. The road is not very stable. And there's not very many people down there. They might have to sit on that bun and that lettuce for a week before another customer comes along. So there's a lot of expenses in Big Sur that are not in places like Santa Cruz. Just a simple analogy like that. The delivery and the expense of things sitting longer adds up with some measure. It's an exaggeration. I mean, the word is a lot closer to Central Marina than Big Sur is to Santa Cruz, but maybe that will work for some.
So bill impacts for marina water, same as exercised before, so, we're looking at, single family, multifamily, non-residential, and you can see the monthly bill. It's gonna jump, these are pretty large percentages. That we're talking about, and you can see that they jump less for multifamily. Because they're moving to the uniform move.
Yes,
Just a question. We always had this multi-family and non-residential consumption charge, right? Or is this something new that is being added?
They used to be, well, it's currently tiered rates for them and what's being proposed is that it be a uniform rate.
So this is new.
The uniform rate's new, yeah.
Mark, why?
The reason that it would be more equitable to charge them that way is because, right now, the tier one water, everybody gets the same amount of water in tier one. So single family home gets 10 units of water and then they go into tier two. 10 units of water for a single family home is a pretty good amount of water. You can get a lot done with 10 units. And most, I think we showed the average is 6. So most single family homes are able to stay below that. They pay tier one rates all the time. But multifamily and larger non-residential customers, they get that same 10 units and then they're in tier two. And so if you're a larger apartment complex or you're a larger facility or irrigation, you burn through your tier one water in a flash and you're straight into tier two. So you're effectively paying tier two rates, which is not equitable. So it's more equitable to charge a uniform rate so that you don't have to. The other way to approach it would be to give larger accounts a larger allocation in tier one to size up their tier one allocation. But that's much more complicated because then you need to figure out what's the right allocation. So a uniform rate is a much simpler approach.
further question?
Yeah, let me just,
You're processing.
I'm processing, and I'm processing the concept of what, of equitably,
Mhm.
of what you're saying.
Sure.
So I'm trying to figure that out.
Okay.
Director Moore.
So, having originally been on the Water Conservation Committee that was formed about 1994 from the Acres Water District, the whole point of tiered rates is to encourage conservation. But when it comes to one of the school ball fields that we serve with potable water, where do you set a reasonable and fair base rate tier one amount to encourage their conservation? And you'd have to go around to each individual school and measure the number of, I don't know, square feet of turf or the number of sprinkler heads in the field to try and figure out, okay, we'll allocate you 5 acre feet tier one for each sprinkler. You all would go nuts as staff members trying to keep up with that. Yeah, and it would be pretty expensive for staff to do that. You'd spend a lot of hours counting sprinkler heads.
It's a thing. It's called water budget based rates, where there are utilities that spend the time and effort to do that. It's very expensive, very data intensive. Takes a really long educational campaign. And it's, it's not for everyone. In fact, it's for very few utilities have the appetite to spend that much time trying to dial in a perfect budget for every account.
Thank you.
Okay.
I think of it as equitable in the sense that if I'm in a single family home, my family, I get to use all of that tier one water just for my household. If I'm in a fourplex and there's 4 families that are all, now they've used that amount of water, that they only get 1/4 of that amount before they're paying more. So by using this uniform method of billing, they aren't paying, it's not going up. It's not inequitable to me, who's the single family homeowner over here, who gets to use all of it by myself.
So that's the multifamily part, which
Yeah.
makes total sense, right? If I have a duplex and I push the first 10 HCF into the system, then immediately, so those 2 families are immediately into tier 2 within 5 units, right? But we need to talk a little bit about the non-residential customer. So Target, they're flushing the toilets like mad over there. Why would I give them the benefit? Why do they deserve the same break?
Because the law says you have to.
Okay, explain that, please.
So, Proposition 218 says that customers have to pay proportionately the same as one another. So if you are effectively charging Target tier 2 rates because they're a large account, they happen to use a ton of water. I mean, they happen to be a large building with a lot of water needs. And so they go through their first 10 HCF in day one, and the rest of the month they're in tier 2. You're effectively charging them tier 2 rates. Even if they had low flow toilets, you know, the fact that they have 30 employees and a bunch of customers using the facility it's not means they're water wasters. It just means that they need more water than the next customer. And so if you're effectively charging that type of customer tier 2 rates, there's an equity issue with other types of customers that are effectively being charged tier 1 rates for the most part.
And reflect that against the EDUs that we sold that customer.
Right, so that customer also bought capacity. When they entered the system, they purchased a certain amount of capacity saying, hey, I'm a large water user, I'm gonna have a lot of water needs. So they bought their fair share of the system. You know, they represented themselves as a large water user. So there's, you know, typically what you would do is you would take their water needs, which is, again, interpreted as their meter size. That Target's gonna have a large meter. You could take their meter size and say, okay, a 3-inch meter is the equivalent of 30 1-inch meters. I forget the exact equivalency, but it's a lot. And so you multiply their allocation by 30. So instead of getting 10 HCF of water, they get 300 units of water because they're a large meter and they have larger water needs. And so you could do it that way. But it's more complicated. A uniform water rate gives you the same result.
It also wouldn't work for those 2,000 duplexes because they're still on the smallest meter size.
There you go. Sure. I mean, there's ways around it. You could say, I mean, you can create policies to figure out how to treat everyone equitably. That figures around those types of issues, but true.
Yeah, I go back to Director Moore's comment about having to explain it to the public.
Mhm.
So to the public, I'm like, well, we're gonna increase your rate, but Target, 5 and below and Kohl's will have a discount, right? Moving forward. Well, not a discount, but we'll pay less for their water usage based on this new.
They will pay their fair share. They're arguably paying more than their fair share currently.
So their fair share right now, they're in the tier system, right?
You're right.
And so I just want to make it clear, right now, it's legal, right? What we're doing right now, charging them at tier 2.
We had a lawsuit.
You haven't been sued.
As anyone else along the same line.
I'm not a lawyer. I mean, but you could argue both ways.
So the point about the 218 process is everybody in a class is treated equitably.
Correct.
And so what Director Cortez is trying to say is, instead of 2 classes, can we make 3 classes? Can the commercial be made a class under the current law? Is one question. And why are they lumped with multifamily? That's, I think, what he's trying to drive at.
Yeah.
And so as an agent, as a district, are we able to come up with the criteria under the 218 law to have a 3rd class? So you have your residential, everybody's doing tier 1, and you have your multifamily as class 2 and commercial as class 3. That's the question, I think, that he's driving at.
I'm trying to, yeah, thank you.
Okay, so they are different classes. I mean, you track them differently. You have to treat everyone within the same class equitably, and you have to treat classes, you know, relative to one another. The different classes have to be treated equitably between themselves as well, right? There can't be a double standard for how you treat one class versus another. That's why it's so important that when we go back to this slide here, I made it very clear that the weighted average of all water sales to this single family class will be exactly the same as the average water unit sold to the non-single family. So if you were to take all of the water sold to a single family, all the revenue and divide it by the amount of water, you basically, you get exactly the same rate. You get this uniform rate. So you're being equitable between the classes.
But if you divided it into a third class, and I don't know that any of us here know what those criteria would be.
Right.
To say commercial could be its own class. So I do understand what you're saying here,
Yeah.
is that we take the commercial, so you'd have 3 towers,
Mhm.
and they all have to be treated equitably with balance.
Well, so if you had 3
Is that
towers,
feasible?
yeah, you could have 3 towers, but if you're gonna charge uniform rates to multifamily and commercial, they would be identical, because there would be no reason to make them different.
So the question, then my follow-up question, if you don't mind, is that I understand that the multifamily using the fixed rate, the uniform rate, let me use the right words, but in the commercial to still maintain a 2-tier rate, can you do that?
You could if you gave them a larger water allocation
At tier one.
of tier 1 water.
And so we would have to give them a larger water allocation at tier 1 by how much?
It would be a policy decision. Typically, the way you would do it is based on their meter size. So based on the size of their meter, you would compare that to single family. Single family is typically 3/4 inch, so there'd be a multiplier that would increase their water allocation. And at the end of the day, they'd be paying, if you did it right, they would be paying the same rate as everyone else. I mean, what we're proposing to fix here is to make sure that everybody's paying the same amount. Right now, multifamily and commercial are effectively paying more than single family, the way the rates are now. And that we're gonna fix that. So we can either do it through uniform rates, or we can give a larger water allocation to those larger water accounts, the multifamily and commercial. But to your point, we could just make multifamily uniform, and we could make commercial, keep it tiered, but give them a larger water allocation.
That's the question. So then going back to the slide that you keep showing us that's not in your slide deck, is of those, when you had 1 and 2 or 4,
Oh,
those are commercial?
the
Those
number of
clients,
accounts?
when you went out to those very large
Yeah,
meter sizes. So
it depends if it's order or marina, but they.
you didn't have it broken down that way, but that's the line of question I think that Director Cortez is asking is there a way to break that out, that you have a third class, even if you give them a higher water usage,
Mhm,
to make it equitable between your 3 towers?
mhm.
What does that look like that Target and Kohl's are paying by comparison?
I would venture to say we'll have the same exact result.
Okay, and that's that's why we're having this discussion.
Absolutely, no, I think it's a great conversation, right? Is to understand that once we create this larger tier 1 for them, they won't get into the tier 2 cost, and they will see a reduction in cost.
So they.
And you have to give them that big of an increase in their water
To
allocation.
make it equitable, yeah.
Because Prop 218 requires that the 3 towers all are treated equitably.
Yes.
So one cannot carry the greater burden of the cost of your organization because they have the greater generation of their own wealth and ability to pay.
Correct.
Okay, so that's the basic premise we cannot get around. Does that help?
That does help.
That helps me. Director Moore.
So a couple of questions on this issue, and thank you, Director Cortez, for raising it. It seems to me that the commercial would be the hardest to come up with a tier 1 amount. So uniform, I can go along with the uniform rate as long as we figure out equitability for the commercial side. So a question for staff on multifamily. How hard would it be to find out how many dwelling units are connected to each multifamily meter?
It'll take a while, but it's not undoable. But again, you're gonna come up with the same number.
Well, no, what I'm suggesting is for the multifamily, we keep the two-tier rate system. But if you've got 2 units on that multifamily meter, you get not 10 HCF in tier 1, but you get 20 HCF. And if you're an apartment building with 40 units in it, you at tier 1 would get 40 times 10 HCF in tier 1 until you bumped into tier 2. That would require obviously some software changes and some additional data about each of those multifamily units.
And a huge set of rates. So our system has a series of rates that it calculates to each, so it'll, rate 1, rate 2, rate 3, so the computer is saying, okay, this is, I go here, I get this rate, I put it in here. So we would have to create classes inside each one for each different set of meter configurations. You know what I mean?
So if there's 4 houses on the one, or if there's 8
It
houses
would
on
get a
one.
tier 1 and a tier 2,
Mhm.
and then if it was a 4-plex, it'd get a tier 1 and a tier 2, and then if it was a 10-plex, we would get a tier 1 and a tier 2.
The
And
rates wouldn't be different.
No, what I'm saying, inside of the program, the software,
You have to.
we have to create all of these different, it's not just tying it to one thing. Each one gets its own
Yeah.
discrete set of rates inside the system. It's not undoable, but I think in the end, it yields the same outcome is kind of where we're headed.
Could I ask Director Moore, what problem would that solve for you? Just want to understand the suggestion.
I'm segueing off of Director Cortez's concern that these multifamily folks are now going on to a uniform rate and somehow that'll look unfair to those in single-family homes who still have a 2-tier system that they have to deal with.
I mean, their rates are going down,
Whose rates are going down?
multifamily,
Well, sure, they're gonna be even in this consequence. And single-family homeowners, Sam, why do these multifamily guys not even have to conserve water? They don't even pay anything in tier 2, and their rates went down with the last rate. I mean, I can see single-family dwellers having,
well, but they pay more out of the gate. I mean, single family, if they want to, they can keep their rates down at 689.
Right.
Whereas multifamily is in 738 straight out of the gate. So there's trade-offs, and I see your point. But another reason why tiered rates aren't as effective, and you were on the conservation committee, so I'm sure you appreciate this, but the reason it's less effective with multifamily is because there isn't sub-metering.
that's right,
Right,
there isn't
so,
a direct connection.
Like,
between
someone who lives in a 10 apartment complex, they're saving water, if their neighbors aren't saving water, it's not doing them any good.
Yeah,
right?
I agree. Somebody who's a water waster and everybody else can't, he's just some curmudgeonly.
Right. So the tiered water rates stop making sense when people can't really do anything about their bill, right?
Right.
Tiered water rates are good when you own your bill and you're like, I'm gonna stay in tier 1.
Agreed.
Right?
Agreed. Now, slightly different, but follow-up question. Could we make fair rates over the 5-year period, which said, okay, multifamily and commercial, your bill is not going to go down in the first year, but we're gonna keep you level.
So that's called a phase in. And most lawyers highly recommend against it. Because you're basically saying, we know what the right structure is, but we're not gonna get there for a few years. And so you're kind of admitting that you're gonna have a period of time where the rates aren't exactly where you think they should be. So it's a sticky,
Right.
it's a sticky approach. I understand the appeal. I totally agree. It helps with, phasing things in, but the opinions I've gotten from lawyers is that you avoid phase in, so rate structure changes.
So I just want to remind us all that we adopted these reserve policies, one of them being the reserves that we can phase in rates and not do an increase in the future when you get your reserve build up there. But we don't have those reserves. So those discretionary choices to say, we're not gonna impose a 3% increase in year 2025, that's not an option we have without reserves, because we need to pay our bills.
Well, not decreasing the multifamily and commercial early on would in fact help us reach those reserves quicker. But you're saying the argument from the multifamily and commercial property owners would be, hey, you're not treating me fairly.
Correct.
You're holding me early on too much.
It's inequitable and will be in a lawsuit. Director.
Just quick comment, I heard earlier that we have duplexes that are serviced by 1 meter here in Central Marine. But across the street in a new housing development, there's a single family residence that just happens to have a separate living unit over the garage. But they were required to put in 2 meters. So do they have an issue? Do they have recourse? By saying, you know, why do we have to have 2 meters? There's only 1 family living here. But we just happen to have a separate living unit upstairs that we were required, or the builder was required and told, you need to put in 2 meters.
Yeah, I mean, building codes change over time. It's just, you know, there's a lot of things that have been grandfathered in that are no longer best practices.
Okay, I just kind of view it as, you know, somewhat unfair. And here you have 1 family that just happens to have a separate unit, but yet they're paying an additional service fee.
We require all detached buildings to have a meter in that state law.
Yeah, there's a lot of state laws around ADUs and what you can and can't, what we have to, how you have to treat them.
Okay, if we can move on.
Yeah,
Sewers.
so sewer, as you know, your current sewer rates are all fixed. So all residential are charged based on the number of dwelling units. And commercial are all based on an EDU, an equivalent dwelling unit, which is a unit that is assigned to them when they first join the system, and it's based on a number of different factors that basically estimate how much wastewater they're gonna produce based on what type of account they are. And so the proposal is to start charging a variable rate so that customers who actually are producing more wastewater are paying more. Because yes, it makes sense to recover a certain amount of your revenue through your fixed, because everybody represents a certain amount of cost, but at the same time, you do want to recognize that there are some customers that produce more wastewater than others. And so they should be paying more. So we are proposing 50% of your revenue get recovered through the existing EDU assignments, and the other 50% get recovered through water usage. And so we'd be looking at monthly water usage for non-residential customers, and we'd be looking at annualized winter water usage for residential. So we'd be looking at, say, January, February, March, figuring out what the average water use was during that time, and then turn that into an annual water usage number. So for Marina sewer, obviously fixed is 100% now, and it'd go to 50/50. So currently they pay $17.98 per EDU, and that would go to half of that amount, $9.45, a little more than half the amount because there's a 15% rate increase. And then it would be $1.85 per HCF of water usage.
When you say first year, the HCF is going to be based on, as you said, winter water usage.
Right.
But once you do that calculation, and when would that calculation be done?
So it's gonna be a new process that the district needs to go through, and so every, say, and it depends, if you take January through March as your winter months, whatever the district decides.
So every April.
Then every April, now that you have that water billing data, then now you take that data and you populate the sewer system, and so every May, starting in May or June or whatever administratively it can be done, that account, that residential account would be charged that same amount for the next 12 months until it gets updated the next year.
Yeah, that was the point I wanted to have
Yeah.
made, is that your the wastewater portion of your bill would change, for instance, every May,
Right.
but would remain fixed from May through the next April.
Fair enough, yeah.
And then would change again.
Yes.
And your wastewater charge is gonna be different from your next door neighbor's wastewater charge, which is unlike,
So it's pseudo variable, right? Because it's changing, but not very frequently.
right? And unlike today, if two customers compare bills, single family homes, they'll see the same wastewater charge on their bill every month.
Right.
And the same between the two houses, that'll all change, it'll be different.
True.
Potentially.
So what does this look like on their bill? So the way this is gonna work is that low water users are gonna now be recognized as being low water users. So you can see a low use single family will actually see a decrease in their bill in the first year, a $3 decrease. And an average water user will see a slight increase, and higher water users will see a larger increase. So this, I think this is good in the sense that it will recognize customers who make an effort to conserve water and who don't contribute as much flows to the wastewater system. And right now, the customers are not being recognized for those efforts.
And this captures a higher cost for our Targets and our Kohl's because we're capturing the cost when they put the water down the drain.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting, you can see in restaurants with 4 EDUs, they're seeing a significant cost. But right now, on the fixed, oops,
And the argument being this is equitable.
this is
It's,
equitable,
it's related to your use, not related to your structure.
you got it.
And it's
Okay.
important to note that these are just examples. So I'm not saying that all restaurants are gonna see this kind of an increase. This is just an example
Exactly.
of a restaurant that was assigned 4 EDUs when they joined the system, but they're using a ton of water, right? And so maybe they're using more water than the district thought they would when they first joined the system. And so that type of customer is going to pay more. That same restaurant, if they're not doing good business and they're only using 20 HCF, then they're gonna see a drop in their bill, right? 'Cause
Or if they're gonna be more efficient in their water use during the winter months.
if they're being, right?
So there's a
I'm
weird,
not gonna shower from
Conservation.
January, April. and May.
there's the strong conservation message here that the sewer customers haven't experienced.
Right.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I know so I experienced this system when I was living in Healdsburg, and I'll tell you what, my family wasn't super happy with me December, January, and February. And I'm like, don't you dare turn that on, right? Turn irrigation off, girls, stop showering.
Yeah.
They don't smell right when they were in elementary school, it's okay. But, it really does change our conservation messaging, and it does help the community in those months.
But do our irrigation customers fit in this category called commercial? So the HOA landscapers, et cetera, do they have a sewer bill or are they irrigation only, that's
Irrigation
water? only?
Irrigation only, they have a separate account.
You have fewer sewer accounts than water accounts because of those irrigation accounts.
Okay.
On the ORID side, we're talking about 4% rate increases, so that's pretty much, that fixed charge is just a little bit more than half of the 38.15, and then $4 per unit on the flow side. And same dynamic, you can see the low water users are gonna see a decrease in their bill, and the high water users are gonna see an increase in their bill.
Questions? Okay, so that was scenario 1. Are you wanting to talk about scenario 2, or you want to go to next steps?
As a preview, scenario 2 is exactly the same thing, it's just the
A
numbers
little
are
bit
slightly
different.
They're different by 2-3%.
Okay, can we go through, you don't need to do it as in-depth, just
Mhm.
highlight.
Sure.
it's all the same assumptions, so you've explained those to us.
So scenario 2 for Ord Water, would be a
8%.
increase of $1.89 for tier 1 and 69 cents for tier 2, and a decrease of 42 cents for the uniform rate. And then you can see the bill impacts here. I'm not sure how many numbers you want me to rattle off, or if you just want to like look through them together.
Well, at least tell the title of the slide, tell us what the rate increase that you're representing on it.
Sure.
And so the public can at least follow us.
Okay. Yeah, so for water, for the Ord Water bill impacts, you can see a median family would see an increase of $11.18. So this would be 8% rate increase. And multifamily would be seeing smaller increases because of that change to the uniform rate. Same with non-residential. So, you know, the single family are certainly, they're seeing slightly higher rate increases than the 8%. And that's because it's a zero-sum game where if some customers are going to be paying less, that means that other customers have to take up the slack. And so the average across all customers is 8%. So if some are paying less than 8%, others will be paying more than 8%. On the marina water side, it'd be a 40-cent increase to tier 1 rates, a 94-cent increase to tier 2 rates, and the effective uniform rate for multifamily and non-residential would drop by just over $1. So they're effectively paying $5.49, it would drop to $4.48. And you can see the monthly service charges are increasing proportionally a lot more than the uniform or the consumption charges, because again, the fixed charges are going up, and so we're recovering more of the revenue through the fixed charges.
So, and this marina rate is at 17%.
That's-
Scenario 1 was at 20%.
Correct, yeah.
And in either of these options, we are also going to have to do our infrastructure, our R&R infrastructure with debt.
Correct. Yeah.
So. Okay,
Yeah, both scenarios assume $20 million in debt. That's right.
correct.
And I mean, when you issue debt, there's certain costs associated with issuing debt that you generally want to make a meaningful amount. You know, issuing small amounts of debt stuff, you know, doesn't pay off as well because there's a bunch of fixed costs associated with hiring, you know, bond counsel and the whole process takes some money. So you usually want to make it for a meaningful amount. So that's another reason that we didn't change the $20 million number. It's a good solid number to issue debt. On the bill impacts, you can see that single family homes would generally increase by about $15 to $16. Multifamily depends on the size of the account. But in these examples, $27 to $53, and then there's some non-residential examples that we actually see a decrease in the bill because these are really large water users that would benefit from the lower uniform rate. And that would apply to multifamily as well. If you have multifamily accounts, in this particular example, I was just showing average water use, but if there were multifamily accounts with high water usage, then they would actually see a much smaller increase in the bill.
So the difference between the two scenarios for a single family is about $2 in your bill. The first 3 columns there, looking back at your 20%.
$17 from the previous.
It's 15, and then in previous was 17.55 versus 15.87.
Right, so about $2.
Almost $2, okay.
Between scenario 1 and scenario 2.
Yeah, well, I'm only looking at single family. These other numbers require some calculation. They're more than 2 columns.
On the sewer side, we go to marina, it would be $9.12 for the fixed charges and $1.79 for HDF for the flow-based charges. These are with the 11% increase. And same dynamic that we described before, the low water users would see, benefit from going to the fixed and variable structure. And the higher water users would pay a larger amount. So in this case, a low water, single family account would, actually pay $3.50 less per month. Again, this is 11% rate increases overall. And for sewer, with the 3% rate increases, these numbers are quite similar to the scenario one, because it's just 3% versus 4%. So it's $20.35 for fixed, $3.98 for load-based charges, and a decrease of $5.86 for low water users.
No. Questions? It's a lot to synthesize.
That's a lot.
And I'm seeing questions. Director Imamura,
Just a quick comment, so, I assume that we're gonna get our customer service staff kind of prep. So, because I assume there's gonna be a problem, regardless of what the board does with the rates, you're gonna have a lot of calls, you know, what's going on. So,
Yep.
anyway, just a
Well, those, we got PR in the room, you guys.
a lot of calls.
We have our public outreach meeting, which will occur after, so tonight, our hope is that you take one of the two scenarios. We will then develop the outreach and hold a public meeting over in the Carpenter's Hall to invite the public in and talk to us about the scenarios and all that. And then the following meeting, we will come to you for our Prop 18 recommendation.
I have a question. I know Director Moore. Mark left.
I'm kidding.
No,
But that was tired, I'm sorry.
that's okay. Please make yourself comfortable. Do you want something to eat also?
No.
Everybody here has gotten seconds. Go ahead, Director.
So, I know I don't, and I probably would forecast that none of my fellow directors like the idea of raising rates, period. You never like to burden your customers with more. That being said, in a lot of ways, we don't have a choice. We don't want to end up in a situation that one valley found itself in a couple of years ago, after fire boards had spent a 12-year period not raising rates for anybody for any purpose at all, and then got behind in collecting reserves to pay for R&R projects. So we don't have a choice. I mean, between our R&R needs, between inflation and other costs too, we are in fact going to have to raise rates. Of course, the question is scenario one, scenario two. While scenario one is the more expensive of the two, we probably need to rip the Band-Aid off quickly, and provide the revenue necessary for current and future R&R projects. That being said, I would ask staff to come up with a communication strategy about this, which does several things. I think it needs to explain more to the public what the legal requirements are on Proposition 218 and subsequent court cases that have caused further interpretation. So what does it say about this issue of equitability, I think you called it? Equitable rates. So a paragraph or two or its equivalent in our material needs to cover that. I think we need a paragraph or two with specifics on some important infrastructure projects and why we need to pay for those. What would be the consequences of not doing those things in a timely manner? You're obviously going to have a paragraph on the new wastewater calculation method. That's got to be laid out really clearly for the customers. might even suggest a template mock-up bill to point people to where they would see various new numbers on their bills. And then, of course, all of the rest of the, if you will, justification for specific rates in specific cost centers. And we probably still need a paragraph or two that explains why costs, rather why rates are a bit different in ore water versus ore sewer versus marine water versus marina sewer versus recycled water. I know that's a lot to ask of staff to try and craft in a concise, clear way, to be able to give to our customers, but I think it's important.
So I want to get back to the work at tonight, and I think all of your points are well stated, well addressed, and I think that the organization has tried to do that every single time they've gone through a rate study.
Right.
Can they do it better? Are there more things that we should point out? We'll get to that. Right now, I want to look at, you just gave us scenario 1, scenario 2. My very first question is, can you pick and choose? Do you have to use the column of all of scenario 2s? Or can you do scenario 1 for particular areas where it's not harmful and do scenario 2, like in Central Marina? Can you, or is that throw off your 2 towers as being inequitable?
I highly recommend you pick one or the other.
So all of scenario 1 or all of scenario 2?
Correct.
And you recommend that because of the law as how it's written in 218 and making sure we cannot be attacked on being inequitable and not being fair to every user.
Correct.
Okay, so that's the number 1 question for me. Thank you. Any other next ones take it up before we start looking at the actual?
Oh, no, I'm good.
You're good.
I had a similar question
Please.
before about scenario 1 and 2, but another complication is, I don't know where the state is at with direct potable, but the recycled water eventually may.
Isn't that the tower, the pink
That's
tower?
that big
Pink tower.
Director, Vice President Schreiner. So in recycled water, that big spike,
Yeah,
when Mark referred to DPR,
yeah.
that's direct potable reuse. So that's
Yeah.
our phase 2 pure water
You want to
moderation.
ask it?
So the price to the customer then will become the same as non-single family in the uniform rate, or it will always have its own recycled water rate?
So depending on how that plant operates and how that plant delivers water to the system, if it delivers it through the RUAP recycled water line, it'll probably be on the recycled water rate. I suspect that will be a potable line. And so the potable water customers will buy water from the plant technically. But that's in our out year. And so in our next 5-year rate study, that's when we would start thinking about how those rates would affect.
And I get that, I think of it more as expansion, but what we're not giving, but what we're selling to the golf courses right now, technically is advanced treated water, right? It's potable, except for the law says you gotta leave it in the ground.
Yeah.
So that's the water I'm thinking of. The golf courses eventually pay the non-single family rate, or they always have their.
They will always have an ATW rate because my understanding right now from M1W staff is they will not convert pure water phase 1 to DPR.
Okay,
They cannot.
okay. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? I'm trying to put my 2 scenarios side by side. Your slides are not convenient.
Oh, well done.
I'm joking with you, hopefully you know that. Okay, anybody have any other questions? Herbert, I'm gonna let you start with, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Is asking the questions about if you have identified concerns with scenario 1, since we have to go through the entire as one thing. Have you or any other director that wants to answer this identified what is choking them on scenario one? What is the hardest piece of scenario one?
That's a good question. At least for me, whether it's scenario one or scenario two, I think my biggest issue right now is the bond, is taking debt to pay for R&R. So to me, that is really what my biggest concern. And so the question becomes, okay, I don't remember ever taking a bond for R&R. Have we done that?
Never.
Okay, that's why I was like, where did this, yeah, so very creative of staff, I appreciate that.
And I was pushed into this space.
Very creative of staff, so to me, scenario one, scenario two don't bother, what bothers me is the bond. I think that's what kind of like drives me, but I could see, because we're gonna take this bond, then scenario one and scenario two are now more, I guess, explainable, or we can explain more, we can be able to speak to the public instead of having increases of 40%, it'll be 20%. And so when I go to the public and I talk about rate increases, to me, the way I see it, scenario one, scenario two, there's not much different. So the pushback I'm gonna get in scenario two, I might as well then deal with the 5 more minutes that I need for scenario one. And so to me, that's what's driving right now. If we already took the ideal of what 9.1 is, said, just using the example for I think board water, and we brought it down to 5.6, then I'm comfortable to speak on that behalf and why we're going that route. The bond really bothers me, to be quite honest with you. It really bothers me. But I know increasing rates to 40% is not realistic, and so that's something that we have to do. So to me, I choose scenario one, because if I'm gonna discuss rate increases and scenario one and two are not that different, I'd rather go explain scenario one so that we're better prepared at the end of the 5 years.
Right.
That's my point.
So a question to all three of you is that if in fact, I mean, you gave us a 4% increase last meeting that we were here. You've come in with something it's a $2 charge here and it's a $5 charge there, but it's a difference of $10 to the single family. For commercial, it's very different. Is Director Cortez's assumption that we would be looking at a 40% versus an 80% or something more if we did not do a bond, but tried to put all of our costs into the rate increase? Do you have that number off the top of your head? Or,
Not off the top of my head, but it's very similar to what we showed 2 weeks, 3 weeks ago.
which was the 4% increase?
Or
You gave us a scenario at 4%, right?
So Marina,
I'll just marine
Marina's
sewer,
gonna do like 40 or.
Oh, it's 40, okay.
40, yeah, it was.
But we didn't really see that, okay. All right, so then I'm gonna ask it a little more generically then, is that between our directors, that what their needs are, our general manager, our finance, and Mark, in going through all of the analysis, you have studied all of this in depth. We're getting a great slideshow presentation and the synopsis, but it is an outline, and so we're looking to you. Is the recommendation that staff and those involved in presenting this to us, is it their recommendation that truly what puts us in the best financial position that they believe is where we should be going as an organization, is to do the bond at 20 million and scenario one?
Yes. 100%. It's the most conservative but safest track forward. Right? It uncomfortably bond funds, and I 100% echo your concern. It's not something I do. I can say in 20 years, I've never done it. This is the first time for me, but we're so behind, we have to do that, otherwise the rates, the R&R rates suffer greatly. I think that you can see that staff worked really hard to make sure that the financial forecast always pitched towards reserves in recovery, but we never met the line, right? So we weren't driving rates so hard to complete in 10. We gave the board the ability to flex that a little bit, plus or minus, and to not collapse the capital program, right? So your O&M it's safe and running. We're programming it for conservative and efficient growth a little bit at the district. We're dealing with rate increases. I think that we have I would say that for the first time, the district has a growth forecast that actually makes sense, right? Using real data to show that marine is not really growing at 0.8%, and we are growing at about 5% in the Horn area. But suffice to say, at the end of the 5-year period, the district will be in the best possible position with scenario 1, because we won't have the deferred capital load looking at us in that future period, right? We want that future board, hopefully all of us, to be like, okay, there's the Chinese proverb, right? You eat the bitter to enjoy the sweet. So we did the hard work in the first 5, and we're at a place where we're ready to start moving out with balanced systems, right? That we can follow inflation in a consistent manner and in a way that treats our customers in the fairest and most sensitive way that we can.
And in that 5 years, our infrastructure is still going to be healthy and on perpetual rehabilitation, renewal and replacement.
Yeah.
And we've avoided catastrophic needs for drawdowns because of.
Yeah, we're not cashing a check against capital.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the Director Momora's point. You know, when it's not new to this district, a lot of districts do it where we leverage against our capital. How long can it survive, right? We're not out digging it up in 70 years. We're out waiting for it to dissolve. And that's maybe not the best practice.
Director Moore.
So, to Director Cortez's concern, I think it's safe to say we try to be a democratic institution, and democracy most of the time requires some sort of compromise. So perhaps we can sell this to our constituency in the sense that roughly half of this is coming from bond funding and half of this is coming from an increase in rates. So older folks should be happy that we're using bond funding because we get the stuff done now and they see the benefit of it, at least for a few years before they pass on to a higher plane. And the younger folks, half of it's coming from rate increases that the older folks are going to be paying and their successors are going to be paying. So they ought to be at least halfway happy. So we're giving them a glass half empty, half full. So where I can think to explain it to our constituency.
Vice President Schreiner, I see that's a hand up.
That way it sounds good. There's a lot of thoughts
I
going
see your
on.
hand going, but I'm gonna call
My
it.
hands are going like this, and part of me wants to hear from the public too.
Yeah.
But when we think about consistency and equitable rates, I went through all the different pages to try to remember which cost center has which proposed increase. And then they're complicated by that change in the way that we do fixed versus variable. And, the first time I ever thought about doing fixed versus variable on the sewage was from Director Mamora. So I'm glad we incorporated that thinking into this. But when I look at, the consistency for scenario 1, Ford sewer 4%, Ford water 10%, marina water 20%, marina sewer 15%. So those don't all sound the same to me. We have a range from 4% to 20% on scenario 1. And so that's gonna be rough right there, and then you have recycled water only 5%. So it doesn't sound like they're all the same, and that's probably where the message team might come in. But even with as high as 15% for marine and sewer, you're looking at a reduction of the fixed rate from almost 18 to 9. And then depending on each step consumption, a little bit more. So that sounds like an increase of 15%, but it's really potentially a decrease for people who are in the lower water consumption for their sewer plant. So it's a complicated story. It's gonna be, I think, really tough to message. And the thing that I do like about scenario 2 is it sounds like we're going on a more stringent increase than scenario 1. But other than that, like you were saying, for consistency of water delivery service, scenario 1 is the more secure or more hopefully easier on your crews or because I know the system is tricky. And putting it lightly, it'd be nice to have, what did you call it, the assessment? The $4 million condition assessment
Conditionally, yeah.
project,
Right.
yeah, it would be great to know that, things are gonna be stabilized. So anyway, that's my thoughts as far as calling it all scenario 1, but having in reality like kind of a range from 4% to 20% increases depending on which cost it is. That makes sense?
Well, that's what scenario 1 is.
Yeah.
It's based on the cost to the centers. Director MMR.
Yeah, I share the concern that expressed by Director Cortez regarding the word bond. I came from an agency that never met a bond they didn't like. So you can see the property tax bills in Santa Clara County, you'll know what I mean. But anyway, as long as we go through and, I mean, to me, a bond is just a one tax. So we need to, make sure that we educate our ratepayers what actually is involved with that. And it's not like, oh, we got this money, it's coming from somewhere. Somebody's been paid for it. So anyway, I appreciate your analysis, and it was really good in terms of understanding. I hope we can translate that and when we do the presentations to the public, and it'll be great. And thank you, staff and all the engineers as well, everyone involved, especially now with customer service, having to probably field a lot of phone calls. There's going to be a lot of people who say, hey, what happened? So anyway.
So I do want to go to the public, if directors are okay at this point. So if anybody in the public wants to address us, we're really excited to hear from you. And I'm asking you to raise your hand and we'll unmute you.
Oh, you don't want to go to the big crowd in the room here?
I'm going second.
Oh, you'll go to the second.
Okay, I don't see any hands going up on Zoom, but if you change your mind, I will keep checking. And, oh, great. Peter Lay. And I don't know how that happens.
Tia will take care of it.
That's what I think.
Let me just go there, it's still awake.
It's muted.
Okay, so right.
Good evening, the board. I have a question on the proposed sewer rate. And the new method is based on the water usage. So if I use the water for gardening, which doesn't require the collection by the district, I still have to pay for it. I don't think it's correct. So I think you should think about it, because I can give you an example. So 2 single family home, each home has 2 persons, but one home has a bigger garden. So the home with the bigger garden has to pay more because they use more water. But the sewage flow from each home is the same. So it costs the district for the collection service and it's the same, but you charge the home with the bigger garden, more than the other home. I don't think it's legal or equitable. So that's all I have. And if you can, answer that question to the public or me later on. Thank you.
Okay, anybody else in the public? Thank you, Peter. We'll answer the question. Nobody else wishes to ask questions? So, Mark, do you want to answer this? I do understand this is why we're selecting the months of January, February, March, or December, January. So if you don't mind going to the microphone and explain why you selected particular months and how that relates to gardening.
That one's right here.
I don't know, but I don't know where the camera can see you.
Right, yeah.
I'm sorry, podium. I should have said the podium.
Right, there you go. Right, so to your point, the reason we pick the winter months is to minimize the outdoor water use. In fact, ideally, people aren't irrigating outside at all during those months because it's cold enough and it's wet enough that irrigation isn't necessary. So I absolutely agree that if we were measuring single-family homes year-round, the colors concern would be a very valid one. But it is an industry standard. It's a very common practice to estimate indoor water use based on wintertime water use. And for all the other customers, they should have separate meters for outdoor. So all the non-residential and even multifamily should have separate water meters for their outdoor water use. And so that doesn't get counted in the monthly water use.
Thank you. Okay, I hope that answered the question. And
Oh.
then,
Can I follow up?
okay, one more follow-up, Peter. We generally try to get all your questions and answer them all at once, but go
Yeah.
right ahead.
Okay, a quick one. My question is not about the water used in different month, winter, summer. My main question is the one I don't need the sewer collection by the district, but the district still charge me for that, So I don't think it's equitable or legal. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, coming into the room. Everybody, please raise your hand simultaneously. No comments? No comments. Okay, back to the director. So we're on tonight. Our agenda says to receive a report. Receive a presentation on recycle from our rate scenarios and then adjournment. So my assumption is there's no action.
No, but we would appreciate direction to staff.
So you want direction. Okay. Okay, so Tom has previously, I'm just gonna shortcut us a little bit here. Tom has previously given you a huge direction, which I think all of us will echo, correct? About how we address this, the bright pieces, the PR piece, et cetera. That's a given. Okay, can we just move on from there? Okay, so the direction I think that we're being asked as a board is to opt for scenario 1 or scenario 2. And those are our sole choices because we have to use 100% of scenario 1 or 100% of scenario 2. Yes, Director Cortez, I'm glad you raised your hand to take the first step.
Yes, before I say that, I just wanna say for the record, I am still not fully on board with this proposal change of the uniform rate. And the reason why is because I've gone through 2 rate studies now with Corolla engineers. And this suggestion of equitably. I don't know, it's taking a different route, because normally there's just a design phase of how you're equitable to the different kind of ratepayers. So just for the record, I'm not completely on board with it, but I just want to make that for the record. That, yeah, that, I'm still kind of just trying to figure that out, but I'll still vote for my scenario, but I just want to put it for the record. So, yeah, so I am proposing scenario one.
Okay, I am proposing scenario one. Director Moore, is that scenario
That
one?
is scenario one. As much as I don't like it,
Director Imamura,
Well, you know, do we have the luxury, so to speak, of hearing our, at least to get some feedback from the public? Or is that irrelevant at this point?
Well, as we move forward, you're going to get your feedback. What we're trying to do is narrow down the input and have interaction with the public here, right? We've had 2 of these meetings now. We've had now 4 meetings on rates.
Right,
And our next meeting is going to be in the public space and broadcast widely. But we need to have some singular thing to talk about, a point of reference, and that's where scenario.
well, you know, I don't want to, you know, appear like I'm waddling or sitting on the fence, but going in specifically, if the board goes in and says, you know, we all unanimously said scenario one, let's say. And, you know, then we solicit input from the public, well, it's a done deal, you know? Why do I even wanna, you know, kind of give my opinion? So, I don't know, that's,
They should have been giving their opinion now.
No, I
At these workshops.
I
so
understand.
I do also want to just push back slightly on that.
Yeah.
Is that they get to vote. And so the ultimate statement of approval, disapproval is the vote process. So once we make this recommendation, we have our public meeting, and I think all of us would agree that if that public meeting, there are well-reasoned arguments, there's presentations, there's things that address what you were talking about, Director Cortez, about why this uniform rate. And there are examples that are given to us. I think all of us are going to listen to that information and say, you know what? We need to bring this back for further inquiry, further review by Mark, et cetera. I think that will happen. And to go to the public with it just so up in the air that it's taken 2 meetings, this gentleman, Mark, has given us 6 hours of great education, but to have to do that again at a public meeting without us having said, you know, we've reviewed this on your behalf, we've reviewed this from the eyes of the people we represent, and based on what we know, and we know more than a lot of the public, about what the needs of the organization is, what our budget is, what our capital renewal and replacement is, what is our wish list for how we're going to meet the upcoming demands to get to the 8,000 acre feet in the future. We understand that. And we as the elected are here to make these kinds of decisions for a recommendation. It's not our decision, but it is our responsibility, I think, to make a recommendation. So I'm not going to tell you which scenario to choose or not to choose either, but I'm just wanted to give you a little bit of where the vote comes in.
Well, I just wanted to put that out there, that's kind of my gut feeling, but I think it's important to move forward with one voice. And my inclination was to go ahead with scenario one initially, but again, I wanted to get
Fair comment,
input, so, anyway, that's.
fair comment, and we're gonna get that input.
Right.
And your constituents, please, everybody should be there, and all of us are going to be open to listen.
But I'm really pleased that you addressed the issue with regarding the variable rates with regard to the sewage. And
Let me
that was
get-
very-
Vice President Schreiner.
I was thinking, and this is switching gears, because for me, this is good, the board, this is the way you arranged it and ordered. I think when we do go to the public, I think it'd be really good to put like a split page with marina water, marina sewer, single family, multi-family, so the family knows And, if we have commercial accounts, you can do the same thing separately. And so they don't flip back and forth to the pages. The page numbers really help, but I think for the public, they don't want to flip so much. I prefer scenario 2 for what I said before about like we're trying to hold down our costs, knowing that shrinkflation is real. I don't know if you've heard that term before, but everything is getting smaller for more money. So, it's like inflation on steroids. But to be consistent with the board, I would of course speak with one voice post meeting that scenario 1 is the best for our publicly owned water district. It's the best for everyone. But I think, rearranging for the messaging for the public is gonna be really key so they can see what they're gonna save on sewage rates while experiencing a 15 or 20% water increase.
Director Moore.
So a couple weeks ago, we got a 3-hour presentation from our consultant on a complicated issue. Tonight, we spent another 3 hours after having given them some direction at the last meeting on 2 different scenarios, both complicated. I agree with staff and my fellow board members that we can't go forward to the public with multiple scenarios hanging out there. Even one of these is more than sufficiently complicated to explain and to understand. So I just want to be clear, I haven't made up my mind on any rates at all in this 218 process. What I have said is, please staff, go ahead and present to us and the public scenario 1, along with some more communication so that we try and get it across clearly. And then I want to hear what the public thinks about that. And I want the public's input because can't speak for my fellow directors on this, but that public input will help me make a decision here about specific rates, which a decision we're going to have to be making in the not too distant future. Thank you.
Okay, so all 5 of us have concurred that we would like to have this brought forward to our public meeting with scenario 1. And you've gotten some really good feedback. Your slides were perfect for us. That's not the thing, but the Mr. or Mrs. Public or they public would like very much to see on one sheet of paper, you can give them the sewer portion and the water portion. And down below, what's the total shift in my bill? Because they're gonna come together. So if the total shift in my bill is plus $5, you know what? I'm not gonna put a stamp on my 218 opposition. If it's $50, you're getting a stamp and I'm walking the neighborhood. So that's what they want to see.
Absolutely.
And so I think that is really good to point out, because that's what I was tearing one apart. Was I was trying to put the water in the sewer and do the math. And
Yeah, we'll
I'm
make
not
sure
fast
there's
enough.
A pocketbook presentation.
Yeah, perfect.
It's a good point, and having only one scenario will help consolidate all the numbers.
Yeah, I know, I was putting, and you didn't mark them 1 and 2, they were separate. That was hard for me. I had to go find the little print. I could just point out criticism, but I don't want to. You were great. And these presentations were great, and these slides were great, and all of us really did comprehend a tremendous amount of information. And that is all going to help all of us in how we go forward with this organization, making sure that we provide the right input to the public. And I think all of us will engender the confidence of the public because we have been so thoughtful and thorough in the analysis and in our understanding that we brought to the table about all of what's drawn up there on the wall. What is our infrastructure that we are trying to maintain, improve, replace, let alone how do we expand it for what is going to be the increased needs. So I think this meeting was good. If anybody wants to make any other concluding comments, now would be your moment. Otherwise, we were going to adjourn and everybody can get another cookie, including the staff. Anybody comment? No. Okay, we are adjourned, and Paula wants to be sure that I did this. So I did that.
Thank you, everybody.
Yes, you used the wrong hand though, Gail. I used the wrong hand, yeah.
Put
it on your Thank you, Paul, for the flowers.
Of course, sorry, before you guys on.